This is a notice for all participants. This is a public meeting and proceedings are being webcast live online. A recording will also be available for playback on the Council's website shortly afterwards. Please note that your name will appear on the live stream and in the recording. Should you not wish for your image to appear on these, please turn off your camera. Third parties should not record or film the local plan hearing sessions, and neither the Council nor the Planning Inspectorate are liable for any third-party recordings. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It's now 10 o'clock, so it's time for me to resume the hearing sessions as part of the examination of the Tunbridge Wells local plan. Charlotte, can I just start by asking, can you see and hear me okay?
I can hear you and see you perfectly.
Excellent, thank you very much. So welcome back for those of you who've attended previous sessions, and welcome along for those of you who haven't attended any of the sessions thus far. My name is Matthew Birkinshaw, Chartered Town Planner and the Inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to hold the examination. This is the ongoing hearing sessions as part of the second stage of the examination of the Tunbridge Wells local plan. So as part of the first stage, we discussed some legal compliance issues around the duty to cooperate. In this second stage, which was started in May and is continuing now into June and some sessions in July, is starting to look at some of the sites in detail and some of the soundness issues around them. I'll quickly run through some sort of housekeeping and procedural matters. Before I will do, I'll just ask Charlotte, Glancy, the Programme Officer, just to turn her camera and microphone on, just so everybody can see Charlotte, who maybe hasn't met Charlotte before. Charlotte is the Programme Officer for the examination. Her details are on the website and she's in attendance today. If anybody does have any queries with regard to documents, attending sessions, any web links or any links for meetings, or those struggling with logging on, as I was literally 5 minutes ago, please do speak to Charlotte. Charlotte works independently from the council and is responsible for all the administrative arrangements for the hearing. So please do speak to Charlotte. Charlotte, is there anything that you wanted to raise at this point?
No, I don't think so. Just to remind, you can remind people at the end of the session just to rejoin with the other link this afternoon.
Yeah, will do. Yeah, I'll just quickly run through some sort of housekeeping matters now. Obviously, we were all meant to be back in the council offices as we have been for the earlier stages of this examination. Unfortunately, due to positive COVID tests within the council's team, it's not been possible it wouldn't be appropriate to meet in person in the council offices. What I would just say, I've seen some emails, both positive and negative feedback with regard to moving to the online format, which we were scheduled to do from next week anyway. I think I've responded through the programme officer to some of those queries and some of those concerns. What I would just say is, yes, clearly, I didn't take this decision lightly to move online, and I certainly did take it, with the interests of all parties, mindful that this session's already been rescheduled once. So what we'll do is we will carry on this week with the virtual elements. Ultimately, as I've said before, the hearing sessions are an opportunity to allow people to make their representations, to put their points forward, and it's an opportunity for me to get out of the council what I need to with regard to the main issues around soundness, which we're coming on to discuss today in respect of Tudeley Village. Ultimately, if the procedure isn't appropriate and it doesn't work, I'm confident that it will. But I would just reassure people that ultimately it is for me to establish the soundness of the plan. And if the procedure doesn't work for whatever reason, then there's opportunities to come back if we need to. But I am confident that the virtual elements will work. As a planning inspector over the last few years, we've been holding local plan examinations. I've done fully virtual, I've done a mix, I've done hybrid, I've done in the room with virtual participants, I've done all forms of various technology-based hearings, and they've all worked thus far. But we'll continue with today. But I just wanted to let people know that yes, I have seen some of the emails and concerns and criticisms about moving to online, but I did carefully consider those representations and those points put forward. But in the end, concluded that this would be the most appropriate way forward. And again, appreciate that it was last minute and quite late notice, but again, unfortunately, that was due to the positive case coming forward last week. I'll quickly run through some housekeeping matters with regard to using Zoom and the online function for the hearings. I know that a guidance note was circulated yesterday, but again, appreciate that was only the day before, so I'll very quickly run through some housekeeping matters. So what I'll do is I'll remain on screen at all time, because as with previous sessions, it's probably me who's going to be doing quite a lot of the talking today. What I'll also do is I'll ask the council's probably sort of main two participants in today's session to remain on screen as well, rather than having to turn cameras on and off. If they're fielding the majority of questions, then it makes sense for them to be on screen at the same time as well. As we'll do with previous sessions, the hearings are they're informal, but they're structured discussions led by myself. There's no presentation of evidence, there's no cross-examination of witnesses, and they will very much run like we have done with the previous sessions. So quite a lot of it will probably start with me asking questions of the council and trying to get to the bottom of some of the soundness issues that I've raised. And everyone should have seen the agenda for today's meeting. But again, if you haven't, then please speak to Charlotte, or please do look on the website, because the agenda for today and tomorrow is online. Where there aren't agendas, and there isn't an agenda for Thursday or Friday, again, we'll defer to the matters, issues and questions document, and we'll use those to go through some of the issues. So as I said, I'll ask questions of the council and get a discussion going around some of these soundness issues. When I invite participants to speak, and please do participate in the hearing, when it's your turn to speak, if you can use the raise hand function. Now, I'm not sure if Charlotte's explained, but the raised hand function could be in one of two places. For me, I can see all the participants down the right-hand side of the screen. If I click on participants, then I get a bar across the bottom and it says raise hand. For some other people, if you click on reactions, which is along the bottom, so there's participants, chat, share screen, record, reactions and apps. So if you click on reactions, down there's also the same bar that says raise hand. So if people do wish to speak, if you could raise your hand, I will then invite you to speak. At that point, could you turn your camera and your microphone on? And then again, when you're not speaking, if you can lower your hand, and turn your camera and turn your microphone off, that would be much appreciated. As with the physical hearings, really, the same sort of rules apply. This is an opportunity for people to put their points forward. This is an opportunity for people to engage in the discussion and in the debate, and I very much welcome and encourage that. However, people must stick to the representations that they've made. So happy for people to participate, but there is an element of, sort of self-policing your comments and your representations. Really, please do get involved in the debate and the discussion, but only around the points that you have raised. Again, as with the physical hearings, we'll have breaks. We may have shorter sessions, but maybe more of them. I'm mindful that people are sat in front of computer screens, myself included. And I don't want people sitting in front of the screen for hours and hours at end. So we'll definitely take breaks, and we may actually take more shorter breaks, just so people can have a rest from the screen, really. And if at any stage you see me looking above or to the left or to the right, I'm not staring out the window or anything like that. I am listening intently. It's just I've got a second screen and some documents laid out in front of me as well. So if I'm looking up or to the right hand side, away from the camera, it's because I've got a second screen with documents laid out. What I would just say as well with regard to today's session, and I've said it at other sessions as well. So where we use agendas or where we use matters, issues and questions, they are the issues that I've identified. But other people might have other representations around other issues that they want to raise. And I'm sure that we've got all day for today's session. But I would just say there will be time towards the end of the session, especially obviously we're talking about landscape, heritage, viability, deliverability, highways, green, but all these issues. But if there are other issues that people want to raise, please do let me know. And equally, I appreciate that some of these hearings, there's a lot to go through, and there's a lot of detail to go through. So again, people might think, well, I really want to raise a point about X, Y, and Z, but I've not got all day to stick with this, and actually I need to be somewhere else, and I just want to make a point to the inspector. And again, if that's the case, at any stage, an appropriate stage, either raise your hand and I'll come to you, or alternatively contact Charlotte outside of the meeting, and she can let me know that way. We've had several hearing sessions already, so I'm mindful that the majority of you have met myself and I've met participants. Usually what I do at the start of every session is get everyone to go around the table and say good morning and introduce themselves. It doesn't work quite so well with the virtual element. There's not a logical virtual table that I can go around. So what I'll ask people to do is I'll ask the council now to introduce themselves and their main officers who will be talking. But when it comes to participants, the first time you speak, if you could obviously, when invited to do so, put your camera and your microphone on. And the first time you speak, if you could just introduce yourself, let me know who you are, and if you're acting on behalf of a particular client, landowner, local group, or if you're just a local resident, if you could let me know who you are, that would be much appreciated. So I'll hand over now to the council. So if I could just ask, please, for the council, maybe just again, so maybe the main participants, whoever that may be in today's session, the main sort of lead officers, maybe just to turn their cameras on and just introduce themselves to the hearing, and let people just see and hear them, and let everybody know who you are. That'd be much appreciated. Thank you.
So, very good morning to you and to everybody else participating today. My name is Paul Shadorevian, Queen's Counsel, and I act for Tunbridge Wells Borough Council. So there are two principal officers involved in today's hearing, and I'm going to ask that they put their cameras on, and that's Stephen Vaughan and Hannah Young. And they will be leading discussions in response to any queries or questions you may have. And we have behind them a series, a number of consultants who have been advising the council over the years. who are on standby to assist the examination should they be required. There are quite a few individuals, and I'm not going to, unless you would like them to introduce themselves at this stage, I would simply introduce them as we proceed and as may be necessary from time to time. So if I could ask Stephen Bourne and Hannah Young, please, to introduce themselves.
Thank you. Good morning, sir. Steve Bourne, Head of Planning at Tunbridge Wells Borough Council, overall responsibility for the different elements of the service at the council.
Morning, sir. I'm Hannah Young from Tunbridge Wells Borough Council. I lead the Strategic Sites and Delivery team, which has been focusing on the two strategic sites within our local plan at Tudeley Village and Paddock Wood and East Capel.
Okay, thank you very much. Just one very quick housekeeping matter that that Charlotte mentioned there. Actually, there is a separate login for this afternoon's session. So when we come to have a break, so a tea and coffee break mid-morning or a screen break, if it's just a screen break or a comfort break, don't log out. So just keep your cameras and your microphones turned off, and then I'll reappear on screen to restart the meeting. But this afternoon, I am 99% sure is a separate session. So when it comes to this afternoon's session, please do use the link for this afternoon's session. I imagine it will be very much the same people, but please do use that separate link. And again, we'll aim to break, around 1 o'clock, something like that. But the second session, please do log out and then log back in. So I believe there are some different participants who have got a different login. So that's just a sort of final housekeeping matter from me. Okay, so everyone should have seen the agenda that's been circulated, and some of these issues we've talked about already. We talked about the last time we met down at the council offices. We talked a lot in the last week in May about the strategy. We talked about housing numbers. We talked about the council site selection methodology. We talked about the Greenbelt methodology. And one of the points that I've raised on the agenda, which I want to touch upon this morning, is the effect of the proposed development on the Greenbelt and the purposes included in land within it, including any cumulative impacts. And this leads upon from the points that were raised at the Greenbelt methodology session around the issue of cumulative impact, and several local residents and residents groups and objectors to the plan have raised concerns about potential cumulative impact, and that's with regard to visual and physical coalescence between the proposed development, 5 Oak Green, and also the other East Capel land and land around Paddock Wood. And when we met in May, the consultants who had produced the Greenbelt review and the Greenbelt assessment talked about how neighbouring towns at a high level strategic scale, so the likes of Paddock Wood and Tunbridge wouldn't merge together, and that was something that wouldn't happen. But it is a point that people have raised, is that actually on the ground there'd be this potential for sort of almost the merging of this development, obviously with the bypass going up to 5 Oak Green and then the East Capel land as well. So I just want to explore with the council how you took that into account as part of the overall sort of site selection. It was that cumulative impact with the growth at Paddock Wood as well.
Thank you. I will start off on this one, and then likely to refer to Mr. Swan, who's here from Land Use Consultants, who prepared our Greenbelt studies for just some further inputs. Just to clarify, and I'm conscious of not repeating matters that were sort of heavily discussed at matter 4 on Greenbelt, but the council had full regard to the level of harm likely to arise from the release of greenbelt at Tudeley Village when determining its strategy and the policies within the local plan at every stage of plan making process. We had the 3 stages of reports, and the stage 1 and 2 informed the Regulation 18 plan and the draft allocation of Tudeley, where we were aware that the harm to arise from the greenbelt if we were to release would be very high harm. And we fully understood this and considered that there were the exceptional circumstances, and they were going to come on to that to release the land on that basis. We did note at that time, and at Regulation 18 in the distribution of development topic paper, which is core document 3.16, that we considered Tudeley Village site acceptable for development, but we acknowledged that there would need to be further work to input that and to shape the master planning to sort of confirm that view accordingly. Between the Regulation 18 and Regulation 19 stages, LUC prepared the Stage 3 report, which provide a sort of refined assessment methodology, and that concluded that the harm released from the greenbelt in this location would be high. And that was primarily due to the strong effects on the encroachment into the countryside, which you would perhaps expect with assessments of this size. It then also concluded that the harm on the adjacent greenbelt land was considered to be moderate. Now, in terms of the cumulative impacts, this was fully considered under Chapter 5 of their Stage 3 report, which is called document 3.93C. And we had full regard of that when looking at the planning policy and allocation. And this essentially concluded, as you alluded to, sir, in your questioning, was that the sort of 2 key areas which were sort of relevant to the consideration were the preventing the merging of towns. And, you know, before Tudeley Village, we'd be talking about Paddockwood and Tunbridge and the sort of merging of those 2 towns. But when you introduce Tudeley Village, that will become a town as sort of defined within this guidance. So there would be a reduced gap, but we'd be looking, it was considered that between Tudeley Village and Tunbridge, there would still be a strong gap, but with the presence of Five Oak Green settlement that lies in between, that would be weakened. But the conclusions reached within the report of paragraph 5.21 that whilst the cumulative release of these 2 allocation sites will significantly weaken the greenbelt separation between Tudeley Village and Paddockwood, the remaining greenbelt land will continue to play a strategic role in preventing these neighbouring towns merging. Now, obviously, bearing all that in mind, the report also sets out key mitigations that could be taken on board to help the council consider ways that it could minimise that harm, and also then considered those mitigations against the emerging draft master plan that was being prepared by Hadlow Estates. Key to that in terms of the cumulative impacts, and I'm not going to go through all of the mitigation, it is listed at paragraphs 4.121 and 4.122 of the Stage 3 reports, but they mention in terms of seeking to put landscaping and open space to the east of Tudeley Village to try and strengthen the gap between Tudeley Village and Five Oak Green. And in particular, they comment on the fact that the proposed location of the secondary school with these playing fields that would be positively contributing to that requirement. And you'll note from that mitigation in particular, which is perhaps the sort of area of greatest concern. I'm trying to watch my language there, but if you look at our policy, and I think it's STR SS3 criterion 7F, I believe, but if you just bear with me, you'll note that we have included within the overall requirements for requiring a high quality layout and design, that the design should incorporate means to ensure that there is appropriate visual separation between Tudeley Village and Five Oak Green, including potentially the use of structural planting on land outside the allocation, but within the wider land ownership. I don't know if Mr. Swan wants to add anything to that at this stage, or if you've got any questions on that before then.
Yes, this was a point that had been raised by several participants, that because of the location of the proposed school and the new roundabout that would lead to obviously the Five Oak Green bypass, Five Oak Green and the proposed development of Tudeley Village, where you've got the primary school there, would effectively sort of become one and would visually and physically sort of coalesce and merge into each other. And then the other side of 5 Oak Green, you obviously got development coming the other way from within East Capel and Paddock Wood. That actually it goes against the sort of very core principles of what the framework's trying to achieve with Greenbelt. So do you think that there'll be enough scope within the master planning and space available? Obviously, you'd have a bypass, a new roundabout, secondary school, it'd be built, whilst there'll be playing fields, there'll still be built development, school buildings, etc. Do you think that's enough to prevent any sort of harmful effects that representatives have suggested?
So
sorry, I'm sorry. I was just trying to find the relevant bit in my notes. Apologies. I think we accept, and it's been highlighted in the evidence base, that there will be a narrowing of that gap, and the between Tudeley Village and 5 Oak Green. It's sort of, I think, the test in terms of the towns, and when you're looking at Tudeley Village and Paddock Wood, and the 5 Oak Green is the sort of washed over settlements, if you like, but there will, with the rail and the road, there will be a narrowing of that gap. But we think, and the advice in terms of the mitigation that we've been provided was, is there's ways to master plan the site accordingly to ensure that that gap, it will be weakened, but the mitigation will minimise that harm in a way that will ensure the greenbelt, the impact on the greenbelt, is outweighed by the exceptional circumstances.
And so, if I could add before perhaps Mr. Swan provides further clarity, the document which is appended to the council's statement, the Greenbelt compensatory improvements to support the development of Tudeley Village, also it indicates some of these measures, including at Plan 3, the particular woodland planting to the the east of Tudeley. There would be, when travelling along, there would be the playing fields. That's community woodland, looking on the northern side. There's then the field which separates the primary school from the two fields that separates the primary school from 5 Oak Green. And then, sir, on the to the southern point, it's important to note that in that location, whilst that is where the roundabout and part of the 5 Oak Green bypass would be located, there would still be the fields either side of the bypass running diagonally across there between the western part of 5 Oak Green and Tatlingbury, which is the small collection of houses on the southern side of the road, and then again a field between there and the start of Tudeley. And at that point, so if I could just ask Mr. Swan to contribute as well in terms of his particular findings. Thank you.
You're on mute, Mr. Swan.
Sorry, Richard Swan from LUC, helping the council with Greenbelt matters. I think Hannah's covered most of it there, really. Our stage 3 assessment, as she says, did include a consideration of cumulative harm. And we recognise in that there is quite a significant impact in terms of purpose too. So Tudeley would in effect represent a new town. So currently you've got obviously a large gap between Paddock Wood and Tunbridge, and that would be reduced by Tudeley being inserted there. But you would still have strong greenbelt separation between Tudeley and Tunbridge, and there are still gaps between Five Oak Green and Tudeley, and between Five Oak Green and Paddock Wood. So the A228 Maidstone Road and its associated mature tree lines is a strong boundary to that Paddock Wood development. So yeah, we accept that there is an impact on purpose 2, but there would still be clear separation to maintain gaps between settlements.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to some representatives now. So I know that some people have been making these points. We'll bring them in. I'll take you in the order that you appear on my screen. So it might not be a logical one to everybody, but it is to me. So I'll go to David Neame first, please.
Good morning, sir. Hopefully you can see and hear me. Good. So I'm David Neame from Neame Sutton. We're here on behalf of Bryden Homes. A number of these points we've made in our matters statement, and I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points that have been raised by the council this morning. It's evident from the council's assessments that the least impact identified on the green belt purposes is high. That's effectively the best case scenario the council identifies, high impact. We see from the stage 3 assessments, and in particular chapter 4, sir, the assessment that's been undertaken relative to the 5 purposes of green belt, which relates back to your specific question. And we can see that the LUC team conclude a series of impacts. And in fact, Mr. Swan's just confirmed significant impact to purpose 2, but also impacts in relation to purpose 1, purpose 3 as well. That leads to the conclusion that the overall harm will be high, and that the site as a whole makes a strong contribution to the relevant purposes of keeping land within Greenbelt. So that's the first point, and I haven't really heard any comfort from the council as to why it's therefore acceptable to create that level of harm in this area. Second, if I just focus on the impact issue in terms of coalescence and effectively settlements merging, our particular interest relates to Five Oak Green, but it is a general point, sir. The gap between the new settlement, Tudeley, and Five Oak Green, in the current form, would comprise 2 fields. We've heard this morning, sir, and we've been referred to Plan 3 in the appendix to the council's statement, which is quite a helpful plan, that in an attempt to mitigate the level of impact in terms of settlements merging, that there will be a need for structural planting outside of the defined allocation area. So within that gap, in other words. So there isn't a solution to provide visual separation within the defined allocation. And that's shown on Plan 3. Further point, sir, is the reliance on school playing fields, and this is a secondary school, and secondary school playing fields will of course contain a huge amount of attendant infrastructure, urbanising infrastructure, because of the necessity to provide appropriate sports pitch provision, flood lighting, synthetic pitches, all of the requirements for secondary education. That is an urbanising influence in itself, and will certainly have an impact in terms of that separation. I think it's fair to say, sir, that the impact will be significant in terms of settlements merging. The experience travelling between Tunbridge, Five Oak Green in particular, will be one of travelling through an urban environment. with just mere gaps in the case of Five Oak Green of 2 fields, the existing gap in effect between the primary school and the settlement of Five Oak Green, and nothing more. That is a significant issue which the council has not addressed, sir, and simply isn't justified. That's all I wanted to raise at this point, sir.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Smith?
Thank you, sir. A lot of what I was about to say has been said in terms by the previous speaker, Mr. Neame, and I've also spoken at previous sessions in relation to this issue. But just a couple of more sort of strategic and general points. You need no reminding, so that the fundamental aim of Greenbelt policy is to prevent urban sprawl by keeping land permanently open. I note the reference that the council made to the compensatory and mitigation measures, but in my representations for this session, the written representations, I do try to address this. In broad terms, the question, I suppose, is to what extent can you measure the quantity and quality of mitigation and compensation against the introduction of 183 hectares, I think, of developed land, which is currently open. And in terms of sort of empirical assessments, facts and figures, at the moment, by my calculation, there's a distance of approximately 6 kilometres between the edge of Paddock Wood and the edge of Tonbridge. The introduction of Tudeley Village, broadly in the middle of that 6 kilometre gap, would result in a 1.7 kilometre gap between the edge of the new village and Tonbridge, and 1.8 metres between the edge of the village and Paddock Wood. So I think the broad point is that on the council's own evidence, harm will be caused. They attempt to deal with that by promoting mitigation and compensation. Question therefore is, how are those two competing demands balanced against each other? Certainly the compensation and mitigation would be planning benefits in their own right, but are they of sufficient weight to outweigh the serious and significant harm to the openness of the Greenbelt? Yeah, so in my understanding of the Greenbelt, or the purposes behind the Greenbelt, is not so much the quality of the environment or the quality of the gap between neighbouring towns, in terms of whether they're semi-natural ancient woodland or native species hedgerows or whatever. It's not so much the quality, but the fact that the gap is actually there. It's the gap that prevents the coalescence of towns from merging into one another, not necessarily the quality of the landscape that's there. I'll leave it there, so there may be more points when the council respond. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll go to CPRE Kent next, please.
Hello, I'm sorry, you probably can't see me terribly clearly at the moment. The light's wrong. Right, I'm Margaret Borland and I'm a volunteer for CPRE Kent. And I've got 2 points to raise. One about the harm to the countryside and one about the risk to the remaining Greenbelt. In terms of harm to the countryside, what does that actually mean? Everybody seems to be talking about, oh, well, what it looks like if you're driving along the road. What about the wildlife? Aren't they part of the countryside? If Tudeley Village is built and the roads are built that we're talking about, habitats, wildlife habitats and corridors for foraging and hunting will be destroyed. the dark skies that are necessary for the survival of nocturnal wildlife will be destroyed. The ancient woodland within the site and on its borders aren't likely to survive well with the incursions from domestic pets and probably some people. And if you think about people, the one thing that I see when I look at the map of where Tudeley Village is going to be is the public rights of way. This is Greenbelt, which is valuable because it is very, very close to Tunbridge, to Tunbridge Wells, to Southborough. I can walk from my front door through the area, along the public rights of way. I'm in an urban area. I can actually get out into the countryside. That's very different to walking in a park. Just to be able to walk through it, that openness. I can walk the whole way to the church so that I can look at the Chagall windows. I can stand in the churchyard. It's peaceful. It's not going to be like that if we build Tudeley Village. That's what the countryside is about. That's what we're trying to protect. The second point I want to make is there's been a lot of talk about whether there is enough separation between Tudeley Village and the various areas around it to protect the Greenbelt. Well, it is very narrow. And what's the risk if we agree to a big development here, which is what we seem to be doing? What's the risk to the rest of that? Who's going to come along and put in a planning application for a further development? We understand that the council have recently recalibrated the level at which a development is considered to cause significant planning harm, and it's therefore unacceptable. So we've got all this nice green belt where someone is sure to come along and go, oh, well, you allowed building there, so we might as well build here as well. It's not just a field. It's a lot more than that. So that's all I want to say at this point.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Brooks Johnson, I think.
Hello, and I'm Farah Brooks Johnson, representing the Friends of Tudeley, and I'm coming to you live from Tudeley. I wish I could turn my camera around and show you the beautiful fields I'm looking at. So thank you to Margaret for raising those points about wildlife, and I echo them completely. The strip of land between the primary school as it stands and the edge of Tudeley Village's development is very small. I'd rather there was just an honest approach to this, and there was an acceptance that Tudeley and Fog, if this goes ahead, which I very much don't want it to, would coalesce and to master plan them where Fog, Five Oak Green, gets a decent amount of amenities and gets the representation it needs. At the moment, it's a forgotten ghost village in this plan, and there is no doubt that when you look at the strip that's left between them, that is coalescence. It literally is two very small fields. And when we talk about roadside, I live by the road, and I absolutely appreciate that setting housing back from the road is a very good thing to do. But that's not really Greenbelt, is it? It's not just about what you drive past. And when we look at how far the Tudeley Village development extends down to the railway, across the railway, adjacent to the solar park, you've got a huge amount of land there being taken out of the Greenbelt. And just saying that, oh, it's okay, the houses will be set back or we'll have a couple of playing fields, doesn't really do anything, particularly just my final point on the school. The secondary school will have a lot of traffic, a lot of buses, a lot of noise, a lot of light pollution. And so in a way, having that right next to Five Oak Green, next to that danger zone of coalescence is almost worse, albeit that they say they'll plant a community woodland and the playing fields are technically green. I just think they're very weak arguments, and I can't, having not attended the days in May, I still don't understand what these exceptional circumstances are and how they can justify it. So I'd be really pleased to hear exactly what those amazingly exceptional circumstances are to do this, to build a town the size of Kings Hill on this beautiful virgin green belt. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's the very next point that we'll come on to, which is a sort of second bullet point on the agenda. We'll just stick with this sort of first point then about purpose of including land within the green belt. Apologies, people move on my screen. I think Mr. Bell's next.
So good morning, sir. I'm appearing today on behalf of both Save Capel and Capel Parish Council. Just for background information, Save Capel is formed from a working group originally started by the Parish Council, and to a large degree their interests are aligned. So having listened today to what the participants before me have said, then it is kind of very clear to you, I suspect, that kind of Save Capel and both the Parish Council support those points. I mean, sir, noting that we're just dealing with Tudeley today, it still is important to note that what is being proposed in this local plan is the release of a total of 407.5 hectares being removed from the green belt. It's a significant amount to fit in a significant development. Nothing the council has said today about separation from kind of Five Oak Green has reassured either Save Capel or the Parish Council. There is discussion about there being a playing field as a means of separation, but to be honest, the amount of land that is being proposed to form the separation is so small as to be meaningless. And so it's quite clear that someone visiting the site, driving past the site, if it was to be constructed as a whole, would be very much of the view that they were probably looking at effectively the same settlement. So I'm not going to repeat the points made quite eloquently by Mr. Brown QC in relation to matter 4 and the green belt put forwards on behalf of Save Capel, but just to highlight the concerns that my clients have. And so there is the issue we've been discussing today about how Tunbridge and Five Oak Green will effectively merge with Paddock Wood through the development at Tudeley. So there's also the concern over the loss of 100 hectares of grade 2-3 productive agricultural land, which is a particular concern in this proposal. And so we've heard from CPRE, and one of the points that Save Capel has raised quite clearly in their matter statement relates to the impact the development will have not only on the greenbelt but also the AONB, which obviously sits close by. And this is an aspect that doesn't seem to have been considered properly. I mean, it's quite clear that a settlement of this size will be visible throughout this particular area of AONB, day and night, and obviously there are impacts that has on local biodiversity and wildlife, in addition to noise, light, and other forms of pollution. So the council's invoked its greenbelt studies taken at earlier stages, and so you will have seen from those studies that the stage 2 study effectively indicated that the level of harm to the greenbelt was very high, and then suddenly that gets downgraded to high in respect to greenbelt study 3. One of the common themes that Save Capel and the Parish Council have raised throughout this examination is the issue that it appears that as a proposal for a local plan, the developments at Tudeley and indeed at East Capel are ideas that were formulated early without necessary evidence to support that they could come forwards. And there is a general feeling within my clients that some of what is going on now amounts to effectively retrofitting and trying to justify a decision that was effectively predetermined for a proposal, and that is something that we would ask you to keep an eye on. So in closing, we're not sure if if you have had the opportunity to visit and walk around the site. So I have, I live relatively locally to this, and my clients have taken me around. But it is one of those sites that really we would urge you to go and see it at some point during this examination and spend some time to take in the landscape as it is now, and then picture it as it will be should these developments come forward. We will be making kind of further points about deliverability in that regard, but it is something we would urge you to do. But so I think those are the points that my clients would want me to make for now. But as I say, sir, in terms of separation, the size is so small as to be meaningless.
Okay, thank you. Let's stick to the agenda. I appreciate a lot of those points have been raised before in previous sessions. Okay, I've got Phil Russell-Vick.
Yeah. Good morning, sir. Can you hear us okay?
I can, yeah.
Sorry, just to be clear, we're sharing a camera, so you are going to hear. I hope that's okay. You are going to hear from Mr. Russell-Vick, but since I'm just come on screen, my name's James Strawn of Queen's Counsel. I'm here on behalf of Hadlow Estates, and Mr. Russell-Vick will introduce himself. He's also appearing on behalf of Hadlow Estates. I'm going to hand over to him now on the particular topic that you've raised and we're discussing. So I'll let him introduce himself.
Thank you. Good morning, sir. My name is Philip Russell-Vick. I am a landscape architect with a firm called M-Plan. We are landscape architects and planners. I've been involved with the Tudeley and the site and the estate for some time. I've prepared during the course of that period, I've prepared a landscape appraisal of the site, so a landscape visual impact assessment, and I've undertaken the Greenbelt appraisal work, all of which I think you will have seen as part of our Reg 19 submissions to you. So I'm going to be covering the Greenbelt point this morning, but also this afternoon on the landscape side as well. Just firstly wanted to pick up on the commentary made by Ms. Young in terms of the cumulative effects, and I just would like to endorse that. I don't wish to repeat the good points that she's made. She's drawn your attention to, I think, to all the key references in the stage 3 study. There is a very extensive cumulative effects study undertaken by LUC in that, so it's been covered to some depth. She did take you to paragraph 5.21 specifically, and the reference there at the end of that to the commentary that the cumulative release of the 2 allocation sites, that is obviously Tudeley and Paddock Wood, will significantly weaken the Greenbelt separation. I also wanted to just clarify for you, for your note, that whilst LUC were mindful of a number of mitigation measures, those mitigation measures which they identify in the stage 3 study are all on land within the allocation. So they have not taken into account the potential mitigation measures that this unique scheme could bring forward that lies outside the allocation, but still within the ownership of the estate. And of course, during the course of a planning application process, it would be relatively straightforward to bring forward those measures. And they include the community woodland measure, which is set out at Plan 3, as Mr. Bourne of the Council identified for you. So there's a description of it there, and I'm going to just talk a little bit more about that and add to what Mr. Bourne has said now. He took you a sort of a little walk around of what would comprise the gap, and I just wanted to add the retained gap that would be between Tudeley and 5 Acre Green. Just wanted to add a little bit more detail to that. The first point to make is that the site of the secondary school within the master plan has been very carefully chosen to lie on that eastern edge of the scheme. It's there for good functional operational reasons, but it's also there because the playing fields and that recreational land will provide recreational space within the Greenbelt, unless it's taken out of the Greenbelt, of course, but also it also provides that sense of openness and that sense of a gap between the retained settlements. In addition to that is the community woodland. This is the land area that lies outside of the allocation. and that is land of around about 6 hectares in size, which would sit between the playing fields of the secondary school and Capel Primary School, and its own small playing field. Then there is a further 2 fields on the southern side of the railway between the two B2017, described by Mr. Neame. I think it's just essentially 2 fields in total, but I think in terms of the realistic gap between Tudeley and 5 Oak Green, we're really talking about 4 fields. One would include the playing fields for the school. The second would be the community woodland, and then there'll be 2 further fields between there and the main body of the village. That would obviously sweep over the primary school and would also include the Tattlingbury Farm area as well. And to the south of the B2017, 2 further fields, one to the south of Tattlingbury and another between the primary school and the village. So to describe it as 2 fields is, I think, to be a little bit on the mean side. It is significantly more than that. Now, the community woodland itself has the opportunity to be designed in a way that is complementary to the landscape generally, but also to ensure and fulfill its primary purpose, which would be to bolster the sense of visual separation between the 2 settlements. I just want to add one further point to that visual point, is that in the course of my visual assessment work, one of the views that I cover, I think it's viewpoint 6 from memory in my landscape appraisal, is located on the outskirts of 5 Oak Green, stood up on the high ground to the south, looking back towards Tudeley village across this very gap. It looks over the primary school, would look over the community woodland and also the playing fields towards Tudeley itself. And what is notable in that view, as is so often the case in views across this landscape back to Tudeley village, is that it's really how very little of the village one would see. So in terms of the perception of a gap, one would not see much or very little of the village itself. One would see the open space between 5 Oak Green, you see the primary school, the community woodland as that stronger buffer, and then the playing fields of the secondary school. Just wanted to pick up a number of other points that were raised. Firstly, by Mr. Neame. I've touched on the 2 fields, and I've also touched on the fact that mitigation measures, in addition to that within the allocation, can come forward outside the allocation, and the compensatory measures that are set out as part of the Reg 19 submission part of the estate sets those out in some detail. I think I'd also add one thing, and that is that the recreational uses within the secondary school, of course, recreation per se is an appropriate use in the Greenbelt. Greenbelt policy, NPPF 145 encourages bringing that forward, and it's supported by paras 149 and 150 in the same way. Mr. Neame also referred to the changing character of moving between Tunbridge and 5 Oak Green. He talked about it being an experience now that we through an urban environment. But of course, the B2017 will be retained on its existing alignment, and it would not go through the village of Tudeley. It would run around the perimeter of Tudeley. And again, as set out in the stage 3 study and in the policy itself, draft policy itself, there will be mitigation measures along the 217 to reduce any urbanizing effect considerably. So that experience would not be passing through an urban environment, it would be as though passing through a changed environment, but nevertheless one that was landscaped and mitigated. And finally, just a little point on Ms. Borland's point about footpaths. Again, you'll be aware that the footpaths are going to be enhanced within the allocation, but also to the south of the allocation as well, within the green belt area. And also there's going to be a new green route between Tunbridge and Tudeley. So that's a new public route and a new benefit to recreational use within the green belt and its amenity as well. Thank you. I think that covers all the points I wanted to raise at this time.
Okay, thank you. I've got Jeremy Ive, I think, next.
Hello. Thank you. Yes, I've heard discussion about the gap between Tudeley and 5 Oak Green, but the key thing from the church's point of view will be the devastating effect of the block of housing planned immediately to the northeast of the church. That's the one that is right next to or south of the railway line, and that's slightly lower. Because we have thousands of visitors coming to All Saints Tudeley, and that view is part and parcel of that whole experience and will affect the whole mise en scène of Tudeley. It will affect the view, especially, which is treasured as you look northwards across to the Greensand Ridge, across the Medway Valley, which is valued by so many of our visitors and those who come to enjoy the Chagall windows, of course, but the churchyard and its situation is all part of that. It'll also damage the biodiversity of that area, including the ancient wood next to the 2017. It'll affect the runoff because the runoff is down from there. It's something like 43 meters above sea level, which goes down to 30 next to the railway line. There's a very high water table, and putting a block of housing just there will have quite a significant effect on that. I feel also that it will be very closely packed in terms of the housing, very little space for people to get out and walk their dogs or just have a green lung for their getting out. So our concern is that particular block of housing to the northeast of All Saints Tudeley, just south of the railway line.
Okay, well, we'll come on to probably a bit more of that in detail later on this afternoon, especially on the heritage impacts.
Right, okay.
Any other comments then just on what we've heard so far, in particular about the purposes of including land within the Greenbelt specifically? Mr. Patterson?
Thank you, sir. I'm Hugh Patterson. I'm actually chairman of Capel Parish Council, and also I'm the Borough Councillor for Capel Ward and Tunbridge Wells Borough Council, and obviously I'm speaking in criticism of my own Borough Council's plan. Essentially, you need to bear in mind that of the Greenbelt land that's been taken out in this local plan, 81% is in Capel on those two sites. And little has been thought about the impact of the residents of 5 Oak Green, where most of the population of Capel actually live. So there is going to be building on, obviously, in Tudeley and in East Capel, and that is going to affect our lives considerably, given that this building will take years to accomplish, presumably. So that was one point. I think it's got the whole nature of life in 5 Oak Green will be changed completely. I'd also like to just point out, I'm also a secondary school teacher professionally, and I actually teach in a school in the Greenbelt in Surrey, and I've taught there for 30 odd years. And as that school has developed, it has acquired more and more paraphernalia in terms of lighting, in terms of new buildings and so on. Now, schools are not, secondary schools are not inert. They will actually respond to their demand and they will respond to what they need. And relying on school paraphernalia for your gap between Tudeley and 5 Oak Green is not going to be effective. The land is, of course, not going to be accessible to the public. Most schools require security, understandably, for that, and they will need light pollution. Playing fields will need flood lighting, and that is incompatible with Greenbelt use. And this school is only very separated. I think the 50 metres of the playing fields for Capel Primary School is only what separates the primary school from the proposed secondary school. And I don't think anybody's established that this gap is wide enough to protect the Greenbelt character of the area. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I've got the British Horse Society. I think I can't say the lady's name. Do you want to introduce yourself? Oh, sorry, Elizabeth. Yeah.
Hello, yes, Elizabeth Aikenhead for the British Horse Society. We seem to be moving into compensatory improvements. That's the area that I'm wanting to ask about. But am I ahead of things, or is this the? I don't want to miss the moment.
Okay, no, I think so. It's still at this stage, just really looking at the sort of wider impacts on the green belts and purposes of including land within it.
Right. So compensatory improvements will come on later.
In what context? What's the specific point?
Well, a number of
raising it now.
A number of people have talked about, all the compensatory improvements that are going to take place. The Hadlow Estates appendix, which has also been appended to Tunbridge Wells's thing, and I wanted to go through that and criticise it a bit, but this may not be the moment for it. It's not really in terms of landscape, it's in terms of public access and whether these improvements are real.
Okay, yeah, probably is quite a specific point that we could come back to later, perhaps.
Okay, thank you.
What I want to do is I go back to the council, but actually what I want to do, because a lot of these points, I know that obviously the Hadlow Estate responds to, I will give the council the opportunity to come back on anything they've heard. But what I want to do is ask the second part of this question, really, and then I'll ask that to the council, but also allow them to come back on anything they've heard thus far. And the second part of this question, which is the second bullet point on the agenda, was whether or not the exceptional circumstances exist to justify amending the greenbelt boundary in this location and the factors that have been taken into account. And this was a point that I believe from my scribbled notes, I think Mr. Smith raised back in the week in May when we were talking about the strategy. And the questions I was asking there were around, could the council meet the housing needs without releasing land from the greenbelt? And a very sort of high level summary of that was, well, yes, potentially in theory you could, but it would be in locations that were, further away from Royal Tunbridge Wells, unsustainable, more rural locations, etc., etc. And so that was sort of the reason for the council's rationale for the one of the reasons for the strategy. But the point that Mr. Smith raised back in May, and it was a point I said I'd come back to at this session, was so what we've heard so far is, we've got the various documents that we've looked at, we've got, things described as significant impacts, high levels of harm, etc., to the greenbelt. So where did the council, in their sort of concluding as to whether or not the exceptional circumstances exist to take this site out of the greenbelt, where did the council weigh all of that into account and take that all into account? And just a very specific point on that, there was a question raised about the school, and as far as I'm aware, the school or the land for the school would be removed from the greenbelt as part of the allocation. I think that's correct. I can maybe see some nods there. But just in that question then, so we've talked about significant impacts, we've talked about potential high levels of harm. Obviously, the council is seeking to meet housing needs, and housing needs is part of it. But where's the council sort of really done that balancing exercise and that sort of judgment about, okay, well, yeah, we've got these impacts, we know what they are, could be significant, could be high, we know what housing need is. Where's the council sort of pulled this all together and really carried out that sort of balancing exercise then?
I'm going to ask Mr. Bourne just to address that. I may have to come back later.
Thank you, sir. And if it's okay, we'll address that point and then perhaps return to some of the other greenbelt points that were raised in the discussion. The points around landscape, biodiversity, etc. If it's well, I presume they'll be picked up further in the agenda. Some of the points that were raised by people there, so we won't look to address those. What I will ask when we get to the end of our piece as well, sir, is for Mr. Swan to just come back again around the points about mitigation to pick up some of the points that were raised previously. So just I think it's important to start with just to briefly recap the chronology in relation to the considerations for removing or allocating sites and removing land from the greenbelt, principally at Tudeley and at land to the west of Paddock Wood in the eastern part of Capel, but at other sites as well. And so that took place ahead of Regulation 18, when the council prepared the draft local plan. And core document 3.16, which is the distribution of development topic paper, which informed the draft local plan, sets out in detail the considerations around exceptional circumstances that were at a borough-wide scale, but were also at the individual site allocation scale. And I'll ask Mrs. Youngs to talk to that after I have finished. I think so. It's important, and this goes to a point that Mr. Bell made, where he was suggesting that there's been a predetermination around the allocations and decisions to release land at the greenbelt. So because it was a draft local plan at Regulation 18 stage, the council was clear that on the information which it had at that point, it considered that there were exceptional circumstances. The reasons for that are set out in that distribution of development topic paper that specifically set out the reasoning ahead of Regulation 18 consultation. And the work which was undertaken subsequent to that, which includes the Greenbelt Stage 3 study and the mitigations which were identified as a result of that, were because the council wanted to have surety and further information before making that final decision at pre-submission local plan stage to remove land from the greenbelt. And I expressed at earlier hearing statements that if there had have been, and Mrs. Young will talk about this, one of the key points being that there was not suitable housing outside of the greenbelt and indeed AONB that had come forward, suitable sites at that stage. If there had have been suitable further sites submitted at Regulation 18 stage that were considered suitable through subsequent assessment, then it may well have been the case that the council would not have decided in the pre-submission local plan to remove land from the greenbelt. There was no predetermination. The final decision to do so was on the basis it was made following the Regulation 18 consultation, and it was made following the further evidence which was commissioned. And in terms of the mitigation measures, they're not an afterthought. They're not retrofitting. The ability to mitigate the impact of a development or considerations of a development is something that has to be considered, and it would be wrong of the council to have not investigated those points post Regulation 18 and to inform its final decision. I'll turn to Mrs. Young now and ask her to elaborate on the reasoning behind the exceptional circumstances to release the land from the greenbelt in this location specifically.
Yeah, I think that's what I want to ask. Obviously, I don't want to get back into the strategy and how the council got to where it's, because we had a lot of that on the other sessions. But really sort of drilling down into the, we looked at those sort of, and I summarised at the start of the question, those sort of borough-wide, circumstances. But where do the exceptional circumstances exist with this specific site? And that goes back to the point that Mr. Smith and us have raised, that, and I think to summarise the objections, it was, okay, you've accepted that you need to meet housing needs. You've accepted that needs to be close to where the need exists. and the west of the borough is typically the more sustainable. It's where things are. But why then this site, considering what we've been talking about this morning in terms of the harm that you identified? Where then does that sort of balance come in?
Yeah, we'll make sure we focus just on those site specifics.
Thank you. I think the starting point would probably, if you refer to paragraph 54 of our hearing statement, I think the key driving force to one of the key exceptional circumstances for us as a borough council has been around the issues of flooding at 5 Oak Green, which are very well known and understood by the council. And in fact, we refer to the fact that there is a location-specific action plan in the surface water management plan for 5 Oak Green, and there's been a specific 5 Oak Green flood alleviation scheme that's been proposed with the Environment Agency to try and reduce the effects of flooding in this settlement. That referenced 5 Oak Green flood alleviation scheme was explored, and that looked at designing and construction of flood diversion and storage area near Capel to provide a better level of protection to the properties in 5 Oak Green at risk from fluvial flooding. And whilst that project remains on the Environment Agency's register of potential schemes, at the moment the cost benefit of that infrastructure hasn't been realised, and it's not taking it forward at this time. So actually what the what the development at Tudeley Village can do in a variety of ways, in fact, is deliver betterment to the flood and help mitigate the flooding to the existing residents of 5 Oak Green. And we refer to sort of 3 specific ways this could be done. That includes natural flood management measures on the Hadlow Estate lands. And the key thing to mention here, and I know that it was alluded to by Mr. Philip Vick Russell, was the Hadlow Estate owns a significant amount of land in this area, and that enables the delivery of measures of flood mitigation that can help mitigate against the flood risk through the delivery of the Hadlow Estate land or through the delivery of Tudeley Village. And they have committed to doing that in the various documentation that's been submitted with to the expected part of the examination, including the statement of common ground between ourselves and the Hadlow Estate. So we have the natural flood management, which will hold back floodwater around Sickham Lane. The measures there can intercept flows running downstream, south, and also the key one, which we've been developing, is the potential for the 5 Oak Green bypass to act as a flood barrier, if you like, to prevent flows coming from the Alder Stream down towards 5 Oak Green. Now, the 5 Oak Green bypass is required to serve Tudeley Village. That stemmed from the infrastructure framework and the master planning work carried out by David Locke Associates and their team, called document 3.66. And we have looked at exploring how that item of infrastructure can not only just act as a road, but can act as an item of flood risk mitigation. And we have appended to our hearing statement the detailed designs that Stantec have drawn up, looking at how that could work. And also the further sort of modelling by JBA that have looked at how much floodwater that can hold back. It is concluded that item of infrastructure can provide a material benefit to reducing flood risk downstream to 5 Oak Green. It could contribute to saving £2.5 million worth of cost damages over the 100-year period. And it would put around 223 properties at risk of flooding into a lower risk band. So it clearly can have a significant positive impact on flood risk to 5 Oak Green. We have met with the Environment Agency to discuss this, and they are, in their own words, excited by this. They see this as a real opportunity to help provide this mitigation. We had a meeting with them in April, I believe, and the minutes of those meetings are appended to our hearing statement, Appendix 2, and they see this as a real opportunity and working very positively with us to try and develop the scheme. They've also identified that they have a funding part, a source of funding for these type of schemes where they can top up to provide the environmental benefits to flooding and are confident that this is the exact type of scheme that would it would be interested in. For reference, I think the sum in that funding pot is about 430 million, and the additional cost of the bypass to have it as an item of flood risk infrastructure is about 1.5 million. So this provides a real opportunity for that flood benefit investment to be secured. But not just withstanding the real clear sort of reduction of flood risk, which is specific to this site. So the release of Tudeley Village can drive this forward for 5 Oak Green. We have other considerations which form part of our consideration of whether there was exceptional circumstances for release in this location. We mentioned the development will provide a need for a secondary school to serve the borough's wider needs, and that will stem from the growth at Tudeley and Paddock Wood, but it provides that opportunity to deliver that for the borough. It also, and I'm sure we'll come on to this at later questions, but it provides the opportunity to provide a new green route, a new sort of active travel route between Tudeley Village and Tunbridge, and actually beyond, from Paddock Wood to Tudeley Village to Tunbridge for cycling and walking. And that has all been identified, fully developed and costed and put into the framework for delivery of the sites. And that's in terms of connecting this land to Tunbridge and promoting active travel. Another key one is that the highways improvements, and again, I'm sure we'll come on to this specifically under the highways matters later, but the development at Tudeley will deliver the 5 Oak Green bypass and the Colts Hill bypass along the A228. Now, there are well understood safety issues on the A228, and KCC has been aware of this for some time and have been trying to find potential mitigation to solve that. They are satisfied that and pleased that the Colts Hill bypass, which would be delivered by both of these schemes, will solve that safety issue around the Critterton Road and Alders Road junction. This is a unique sort of, that this can be delivered, this current safety issue can be delivered through the delivery of Tudeley Village. And also the 5 Oak Green bypass, 5 Oak Green Village is a sort of constrained, the road going through, the B2017 going through 5 Oak Green is constrained, and hence why we're proposing the 5 Oak Green bypass. We know that there's a long-term aspiration to seek to deliver traffic calming measures within 5 Oak Green, more akin to a village feel. KCC have confirmed that because it is the B road at present, a lot of those aspirations cannot be installed. But actually, once the 5 Oak Green bypass is in place, that road through 5 Oak Green Village will be downgraded, and that will allow the sort of low traffic measures and a more village and a safer pedestrian environment within 5 Oak Green alongside. And then finally, the requirement for this development to be exemplar design with exceptional levels of permeability. We're really pushing this development in terms of the garden settlement principles, and I think you will note from the Hadlow Estates delivery strategy, which was submitted at Regulation 19 stage, that what they're seeking to do there is meeting those high aspirations. And we think that contributes to the exceptional circumstances alongside. And I don't know if Mr. Bourne wants to add anything to what I've just said.
I think so. Just to pick up on that final point, is that the ability to provide a very sustainable development, and I'm sure that's something that we'll come on to talk about in terms of one of the other agenda items subsequently, for a significant number of people. Again, is a contributory factor to the exceptional circumstances point. So if I could just to sort of conclude here on the other points, which were to come back on the matters raised by others. I'm grateful to Mr. Russell Vick, who provided a fuller description of the land between Tudeley and 5 Oak Green, and particularly that the community woodland would be located between the school, secondary school, it's playing fields and Capel primary school, and again with the subsequent fields beyond that. Capel primary school being relatively low-lying building. It's a story and a half, one story in one place, 2 in others. It is an unassuming building with extensive vegetation to the immediate west of that, and then the fields to the east. And so to just finish from the council's perspective at this point, ahead of responses, I'd like to ask Mr. Swan to just provide some further views as to the effectiveness of both the woodland mitigation, which I think is what a lot of the focus has been on, but additionally some of the other mitigations that were identified in the level 3 Greenbelt study.
So with regard to the gap between Five Oak Green and Tudeley, we suggested planting to the east of Tudeley to help maintain that separation from Five Oak Green. And I think the proposed community woodland is definitely going to help with this. Structural planting can make quite a difference to a gap. A gap isn't just about distance. The screening of views can make a very important difference to perceived separation. Another key point here, we talked about maintaining a setback from the B2 107, retaining roadside vegetation, trees and woodland and so on. And the fact that the B2017 runs around the edge of Tudeley rather than through it means that there isn't going to be a perception of going through one urban area straight into another urban area. And then I think lastly, in terms of harm to the Greenbelt purposes, it's probably worth pointing out that purpose 2 is about separation of towns. And obviously the gap between Five Oak Green and Tudeley contributes to the separation between Tudeley and Paddock Wood, but Five Oak Green is a village rather than a town. So I think it is worth making the point that there is still separation between Paddock Wood and Five Oak Green as well. So the gap between towns is being maintained, but that's not to say that the gap between Five Oak Green and Tudeley isn't being maintained as well by this proposed structural planting and by that setback of development from the B2017 and the way the B2017 does run around rather than through Tudeley.
Just to come back before we introduce others, just notice this was the points that I think Mrs. Young was making in particular. We don't get drawn too much into the detail of the flooding necessarily, but in terms of some of the factors that you discussed, what factors would you say are factors that weigh in favour of the development as sort of tangible benefits rather than factors that are necessary to mitigate its impacts? So what I mean by that is you talked about the Five Oak Green and benefits that would bring about, but presumably that's required to mitigate the impact, to mitigate the harmful impact of this development on traffic. Essentially, that's what the Five Oak Green bypass is seeking to do. Is that not the case? Is actually seeking to mitigate its impacts rather than actual a benefit? And equally, you talked about this sort of exceptional sort of exemplar design, but again, is that not, good design is not just a requirement of all development proposals?
So perhaps I can begin to address that if that's acceptable to you. Quite clearly, the benefits associated with the proposed development are capable of being material when it comes to considering exceptional circumstances on a site-specific level. Just as a matter of reference, you'll be aware of the Compton Parish Council case, and no doubt your comments may have actually been picked up from your understanding and knowledge of that case and other cases too. And it was argued before the judge in that case that where mitigation was required as an aspect of development, that it shouldn't be taken into account as a matter forming part of the exceptional circumstances. And that was in terms rejected by the judge. And I'm just going to read from paragraph 136 and 137 of that judgment. It's not on all fours with our circumstances, but then cases rarely are. But the general points in issue are of direct relevance. Mr. Kimblin also took issue over the inclusion as part of the exceptional circumstances, which the allocation offered, of its contribution to sustainable transport, including a new station. He submitted that these financial contributions were necessary to meet the impact of development and legally irrelevant. Contributions necessary to make a development acceptable were either immaterial or not exceptional. And the judge goes on to say, this echoes the earlier argument he had already dealt with in relation to the contributions which development elsewhere would make to sustainability in other sites. And the judge said, in principle, I accept that mitigation measures are not a reason for granting permission and would not be factors adding to exceptional circumstances favouring the release of land from the green belt. But with this caveat, and it's an extremely important one, other than as a means of choosing between competing sites where the potential for mitigation affected the choice. So, and one can extend that in terms of a choice of strategy, spatial strategy, having regard to the availability of sites, the size of sites, and what it is they can produce in terms of sustainability credentials. And that includes the capacity to provide development on site, which increases internalization and therefore sustainability, but also which may also have off-site benefits, which are directly related to the development of the site itself. And as the judge went on to say, that can be important where, as here, the inspector and the council, bearing in mind, sir, that your judgments here are independent of the council's judgments, had to undertake a comparative exercise in choosing which combination of allocations would constitute a sound spatial distribution of development, contributing also to more widely beneficial infrastructure. So that's a key point. And the judge went on, actually in paragraph 137, to say that the claimant's submission had not fully taken on board the significance of the contribution to the infrastructure. As with other forms of infrastructure, the contribution assists the achievement of a facility, here a new station, which is obviously of wider importance than simply providing for the allocation site users. It can provide for existing users in its vicinity. And that wider aspect, and this is the point, that wider aspect is plainly material. So when you come to look at what is being provided here, although it does meet the requirements of the development, it has a wider aspect, which is plainly material. And he goes on to make a further point, but there is a more general point, that this is a sustainable site on which various needs can be met. The overall qualities of the site can contribute to local exceptional circumstances. So bearing in mind all of the benefits which are likely to accrue through the development of this site, both in terms of the sustainability of the development, proposed development itself, given the size of the land available to meet need in this one location, and the off-site benefits, facilitated in part by the necessary infrastructure which is directly related to the development, and also by adjoining land which is under the control of the promoter, taking all those matters into account, plainly there is that nexus, and plainly there is a case to be made for exceptional circumstances based on those considerations. So I hope that assists you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Smith will go to first, as I did refer directly to you, so you might have something to say here. Mr. Smith, do you want to come
Thank you, sir. I'm grateful that you have a scribbled note of a question that I asked a month ago. Thank you very much for recording that. Just to tackle that last point first, I understood, I think I understood the first point that Mr. Shadaravian made was that in terms of mitigation, that wouldn't be an exceptional circumstance other than in distinguishing between two competing sites which could be allocated for development. I think that's right, from what he said. Relating that specifically to the question of flooding, you heard from Mrs. Young that the allocation of Tudeley would, in effect, address the flooding issues around 5 Oak Green. I think that's what my note says. So I suppose through you, sir, a question to the council: what other alternative options were considered that may have addressed the potential flooding, or sorry, not potential, the flooding issues around 5 Oak Green? But so before you ask that question, if I could address some of the other points that have been made. The first point, I think, in relation to exceptional circumstances, as we all know, the NPPF, and I think we touched on this at previous sessions, the NPPF says that before exceptional circumstances exist, the local planning authority should be able to demonstrate that they've examined all other reasonable options. It's from paragraph 141 of the NPPF, including that they have communicated with adjoining authorities, reference any housing need that can't be met within their borough or their authority's area. And we know, sir, because you suspended the programme, that you weren't satisfied that the council had addressed that issue, the duty to cooperate with other adjoining local authorities, even though for the last at least 3 years, because I'm looking at the 2018 distribution of development topic paper.
I'll stop you there, Smith. I don't want to go back into any of the duty to cooperate discussions. I know that we've had a lot of that already, and this is the exact same point that has been raised on several occasions. And I think I actually stopped Save Cable from making it yet again at the last week in May. It's a point that is firmly in my mind and firmly understood.
I understand, sir. I wasn't going to dig into that. I was simply highlighting the fact that you suspended this process because of what you perceived to be the council's failure to undertake the duty to cooperate, even though the council had identified exceptional circumstances in relation to Greenbelt release some way before, at least in 2018. That's the simple point I was making, sir. The next point, the council referred to the distribution of development topic paper, CD 3.16, which was published in 2018, which highlights the exceptional circumstances that they claim exist to allow for the release of Greenbelt land. The same list pretty much appears in the development strategy topic paper, which is document 3.127. It's a paragraph 6.183 of that document. And that sets out the following factors considered to contribute to exceptional circumstances. And it goes through the list. I won't repeat the list, but in summary, it's to do with heavily constrained authority, high demand for development, they do mention neighbouring authorities unable to meet their needs, and so on. You'll be able to read them, sir, as you already have, no doubt. We heard a few moments ago from Mrs. Young that exceptional circumstances related to flooding mitigation around 5 Oak Green, the bypass around 5 Oak Green, and exemplar design. You've already made the point about design, so which I won't repeat. That would normally be expected for developments. You've already made a point about the bypass, which again I won't repeat. I was going to make a similar point. And in relation to flooding, I'm sure the residents who are affected would be delighted if the flooding was alleviated around 5 Oak Green. But I think so. All that's been outlined, those three things, flooding, the bypass, and exemplar design, don't appear in the exceptional circumstances list in the two core documents I referred you to a few moments ago. But it comes down to, I think, so the benefits of the scheme versus the mitigation, sorry, benefits of an allocation versus the mitigation of that is needed because of an allocation against the requirement to demonstrate exceptional circumstances that may exist. These things are very beneficial, planning benefits, no doubt, in their own right. They are mitigation that's required if a large development is going to happen in the Greenbelt. There will be impacts which need to be mitigated. But the fundamental question is, do they constitute exceptional circumstances? And if they do, and they require a balancing judgment, where is that set out? And if the exceptional circumstances include flooding, bypass, and exemplar design, they don't appear to have appeared in the documentation that the council has published in 2018 and 2021 to justify the exceptional circumstances. Those are all the points I wanted to make, so thank you.
Okay, Mr. Neem next, please.
Thank you, sir. A lot of the points that I wish to make have been made, so I won't go over those again. But just in order to assist you, sir, I just wanted to sort of track through the thought process and the evidence base, really, in answering this question about whether or not exceptional circumstances exist to justify amending the boundaries as the council seek to amend for this specific proposal. And I think so. We need to start at the point that Mr. Shadaravian's just helpfully made in relation to the Compton case and looking specifically in relation to alternatives and the sustainability credentials of those alternatives. And so we know from the sustainability appraisal, CD 3130A, that the council considered three primary options. They introduced an option one quite late in the process, but that option for 1,500 units, and option two is the option they ultimately chose, option three being a different variation again. We helpfully see, Sarah, if we look at the sustainability credentials of those options, and they're set out on pages 93 to 96 of the essay, that actually option one, 1,500 units, is in marginal terms, but albeit it is a more sustainable option by the council's own evidence base than the option that it chose. And perhaps of particular relevance to this point is the fact that the council notes at paragraph 6.2.35 that all options score positively for the economic objectives, and they go on to say that the environmental objectives vary with each option, and concluding then in the next paragraph that for all of the options, environmental protection conflicts with economic and social growth, but that the negative impacts are lessened by developing a garden settlement that is at a smaller scale, namely option one. So having reached that point, I then raised the question in my own mind as to why, therefore, option 1 hasn't been carried forward into any other analysis. We don't find it anywhere else. We don't find any consideration of it in the strategic sites master planning document. That clearly relates to a quantum of development, which is ultimately option 2. We've already heard that the stage 3 assessment effectively looks at the boundary of the proposed allocation, option 2. Perhaps the answer lies in the fact that the council has, by its own definition, been led by the site promoter on this specific site, as distinct from the approach taken elsewhere. And so that's mentioned in numerous locations. You'll see that in CD 3.67 at paragraph 5.1. You'll also see it in paragraphs 8 to 10 of the council's matter 6 statement. So it's difficult to see how, therefore, the council's reached a conclusion that exceptional circumstances exist to redefine the greenbelt boundaries at the scale it is now proposing. When looking at the options, looking at the credentials, the sustainability credentials, a lower scale, smaller scale of development appears on the council's evidence to be more sustainable and hasn't been carried forward for further assessment. That's the main overriding point, sir, that I can't reach a reconciliation in the evidence base between what the council is proposing now and what its evidence base suggests it should be doing. There's a separate related point, sir, which you touched on, which relates to the extent of the greenbelt boundary release proposed, and you flagged rightly, sir, that the secondary school and its playing field area is proposed to be removed from the greenbelt. Even though, as we know from Mr. Russell Vick's note earlier, that is a use which is an appropriate use within the greenbelt. And we can see from the council statements that the intention is to deal with defining the final limits of built development and in turn the greenbelt boundaries, as I understand it, through a 5-year review of the plan after the development management process has progressed, namely that the plan will catch up with a proposal that is advanced at application stage by a site promoter. That can't be right, sir. We need to establish the boundaries now.
I think just to interrupt, I think, and the council can jump in if this is an incorrect assumption, but the plan seeks to remove the extent of the allocation from the greenbelt as shown on the policies map, and then the sort of the red dotted line is the envisaged limits to built development. Is that correct?
It is. That is correct. And there are some other small parcels of land which are proposed to be taken out of the greenbelt, which extend beyond the allocation. But that is to ensure that the allocation, the greenbelt edge and the boundary of the greenbelt reflects the paragraph 143 of the MPPF, and specifically there are defined boundaries clearly using physical features that are readily recognisable and likely to be permanent. So that is how shaped it, and we have answered that in our hearing statement.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, Mr. Neal. Just want to clarify that point.
No, I'm grateful for that clarification, sir, and apologies if I was slightly unclear in the point I was getting at. So that the greenbelt boundary is defined, but the limits to built development boundary is a proposal which would be refined after the event. That obviously leaves open the issue of where that limit of built development boundary will ultimately end up. Because effectively there will be scope within the whole of the area removed from the greenbelt for that limit of built development to be laid out. And the council's intention, as I understand it, and I'm more than happy to be corrected on this, but it is that limit of built development boundary will be defined once the application process is commenced and potentially concluded, and the boundary is defined through the development management process. So that leaves you in a difficult position if that is right, because you can't be certain as we sit here and now as to the extent of development that will take place within that area to be removed from the greenbelt. And take, for example, where the secondary school is, in the event that the master plan evolves and changes and that the secondary school isn't located in that area or is pushed further to the east or to the west, that will have a differing effect on the surrounding remaining green belts, the relationship with 5 Oak Green and so on. So we really do need to have clarity on that element of the allocation in order to understand whether in this instance, the exceptional circumstances test has been met. I was going to cover the points in terms of mitigation, but they have been ably covered by other speakers, so I won't repeat those, sir.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, we don't need to repeat what others have said. I think just in terms of limits to built development, we went through this in quite some detail at the previous session on specifically this point, and we had a sort of good debate around that in the context of this site and also Paddock Wood, but no, points noted, but we don't need to get back into that. What I would just do before I go on though, it is a point that Mr. Neem has made. In the sustainability appraisal, so in the essay, and this is the one that I've got open, which I'm pretty sure is the Reg 19 essay, is looking at the options for Tudeley Village, and paragraph 6.2.36 says for all options, environmental protection conflicts with economic and social growth and negative impacts are lessened by developing a garden settlement that is smaller in scale. The very severe environmental impacts identified for option 3 call into question the suitability of this option. So that was the larger option. Then concludes that it is also noted that the downside of option 1 is that smaller contributions would be available for improvements in flood risk elsewhere. We'll come on this afternoon to talk about sort of deliverability and viability in a bit more detail. But so at that sort of high level stage, at that SA stage, where it says that smaller contributions would be available for improvements in flood risk elsewhere, what's that sentence saying? So is that saying that option 1 is unviable? Was it a non-starter? Why was that sort of option cast aside at that stage? I think that was a point that Mr. Neem was getting at.
So, thank you.
Hello, sir. My name is Katie McLeod. I worked on the sustainability appraisal for the council. So just to clarify that point, you're right that the final sentence in that paragraph 6.236 is implying that option 2 is favoured for reasons of flood betterment. If you look through table 28, forgive me, on page 93, prior to that, you'll see that the actual difference in the scores between options 1 and 2 is quite marginal. Option 1 scores slightly better on a couple of objectives, and option 2 scores slightly better on another. But overall, the council felt that the betterment in flood risk for off-site was significant in its decision to allocate option 2.
So just try and help me understand that. So in terms of the flood risk betterment, we've talked about the bypass, and we'll talk about this in a bit more detail on the highways. So talk about the bypass, and as part of this development, what you said is to enable a development of a strategic site in this location, there will need to be a bypass of 5 Oak Green. So 5 Oak Green, as a settlement, you talked about it within your statements about reduced carriage widths, on-street parking, etc., etc. So you said, okay, so we need a bypass. And what you said earlier was that the bypass not only mitigates the impact of development, but it actually also allows for this this flood risk betterment, this flood risk improvement. He talks about the EA, and I've seen the note that was done by, I think, JBA Consulting. It talks about how it would all work. So if the bypass was needed for a strategic site in this location, presumably it was needed for option 1. So if the bypass was needed under option 1, presumably therefore it would have given rise to the same benefits in flood risk, i.e. this ability to sort of manage and better prevent water flows.
So the cost of the bypass without the flood, the flood risk betterment, which would be occasioned by works carried out on the bypass, would be additional works. It provides the opportunity to create flood storage and the provision of other flood infrastructure because the bypass is being constructed along the proposed route. So it's an additional expense, but it would be facilitated by the development and by the construction of the bypass. That is my understanding.
That's correct. I think that the one thing to add to that as well, that our viability assessment has confirmed that the delivery of Tudeley Village, providing 2,800 homes, can deliver the 5 Oak Green bypass as a road, wholly through development contributions, and as a road will not be reliant on external funding. If we were to decrease that to 1,500, it'd be very unlikely that that would be delivered through development contributions alone, and would then be reliant on funding. And I think that echoes sort of also the size of the allocation, being able to provide the sustainable uses and mix of uses and supports the what is being shown in the plan. And I know that's the next issue we're going to move on to create a genuinely sustainable settlement with the mix of uses, including the secondary school, alongside to support that.
So I wonder if I might just make one other point as well. It's a question of relevance, really. The fact that option 1 and option 2 might offer similar benefits, and I say that academically, theoretically, doesn't mean to say that one discounts the relevance of these as exceptional circumstances for the option that has been chosen for the various reasons it has been chosen. So even if it could have been available for option 1, which is disputed, but even if it could, theoretically, it doesn't lessen the significance of that factor when one comes to consider exceptional circumstances in relation to the chosen option.
Okay, we'll carry on around our virtual room. I've got Mr. Patterson next.
Thank you, sir. I'm just here just to question the link between flood alleviation in 5 Oak Green and the Tudeley development, really. I mean, first of all, in terms of timing, it was clear that the Borough Council had chosen Tudeley as a site before they were even aware, really, that there was a flood problem in 5 Oak Green. It was the Parish Council in a meeting, I think, in the autumn of 2018. I may be subject to correction on the timing, but it was the Parish Council who informed them there was a flood issue in 5 Oak Green. They aren't the lead flood authority, of course, the County Council. So that is one point. The second point is that there's no real fluvial link between 5 Oak Green and Tudeley. I mean, you could alleviate the flooding in 5 Oak Green by the development in any other place in the borough. Just because Tudeley's next door to 5 Oak Green doesn't mean that it necessarily has to be paid for the works. The third point I'd like to make is that the Environment Agency have had a scheme in place for flood alleviation in 5 Oak Green since 2010. In 2016, they were not prepared to pay for it because they said the cost outweighs the benefits. I'm a bit surprised that suddenly in April 2022, just before these hearings, they suddenly decide that they possibly could pay the £2.4 million, I think the figure was, to actually make these proposals. And it seems to me that it's very speculative. I mean, what we have, and I don't want to go into the details of the 5 Oak Green bypass, but clearly that bypass, in order to accommodate a dam, would have to be built on a viaduct, which would be in part of the impact on the landscape, would also mean taking more land out of the metropolitan greenbelt, in addition to the amount of land that's already been taken in the same parish, where 81% of the Metropolitan Greenbelt grab has been already asked for. So I think it's as I said, I think the link between flooding and flood alleviation and Tudeley is a ex post facto justification for this circumstance. I don't think that was originally in the mind of the Borough Council. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Borland.
Thank you. So I'm not intending to go back over all the other reasonable options that were discussed at the last sessions, but I just wanted to make the point that what we're talking about here is the release of 182 hectares of greenbelt land, and only half of that, well, 52% to be precise, is seen as developable. So for me, this can't be a reasonable option. It's not efficient use of land. We're giving up a huge amount of greenbelt. And according to the council calculations, because they're only looking at the developable area, that's about 30 dwellings per hectare. If you look at the whole site, it's more like 15 dwellings per hectare. Has anybody noticed the housing crisis? I believe that there is a need for housing, but I'm not sure that this is a really good way to address it. And my second thought is that I do actually take exception with the cycle path into Tunbridge being described as a green route. My understanding is that that will have to be hard surface, it will have to be lit. What's green? And it will be going across open fields and through ancient woodland. And then it will feed people into the busy streets of Tunbridge itself. Not sure that's very green. Thank you very much.
Okay, Mr. Russell.
Yep. Ooh, a bit low there. Oh, so yeah, John Russell, Director at Motion, and I'm instructed by Save Capel primarily to speak on highway matters, which I know we're turning to this afternoon, sir. So I'll be extremely brief. First point I wanted to make was a comment that Miss Young made about the 5 Oak Green bypass and Colts Hill bypass. According to document reference TWLP 022, from what I can see, the development at Tudeley is not expected to deliver Colts Hill bypass. It's not listed in the infrastructure under the Tudeley scenario. So I'm extremely pleased to hear from Tunbridge Wells that they are now going to be, but we may have to resolve that issue this afternoon, sir. The other comment I was going to make, and the speakers before me have all been very eloquent on the flood mitigation and the timing of this. The 5 Oak Green bypass is without doubt required as a highway mitigation measure to make the development at Tudeley acceptable. I've heard today, and I'm only a simple engineer, I've probably misunderstood something, that the potential to use it for flood alleviation was involved in the decision making on Tudeley. And I just a little bit confused there because, of course, the Environment Agency correspondence is dated April 2022. The hydraulic modelling report by JBA, which identifies the benefits and quantifies the potential cost benefit to society, is dated May 2022 this year. So I can't understand how they could possibly have had any influence in the decision to allocate land at Tudeley and withdraw land out of the Greenbelt. That was it, sir. I'm sure we'll speak more this afternoon.
Okay, Mr. Bell.
Apologies, sir. I switched screens there unexpectedly. I mean, sir, as we've been sitting listening to the speakers going before, gradually my list of points has been ticked down to nothing. But sir, I'd just like to summarise what Safe Capel and the Parish Council's position is in respect of exceptional circumstances. And that arises in paragraph 35 of our matter statement, effectively. I mean, everything we've heard today from the council doesn't reassure Safe Capel or the Parish Council that the evidence base does provide any evidence of exceptional circumstances. It's far from clear to us that the considerations set out in the case of Compton have been followed, and it just seems that the allocation is being justified in respect to the need of meeting a housing target. So, sir, really, that's our position. It hasn't changed from anything we've heard today.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Jones?
Thank you. Good morning. Good afternoon, sir. Gregory Jones, Queen's Counsel, attracted by Provision and acting on behalf of Cooper Strategic Land Limited. So it's just a very short point, picking up on the submission of Mr. Shadarivan, Queen's Counsel, on the Compton case. But just for your notes, it's our question 8 on this session, which refers back to matter 4. And I'm not going to go back over matter 4 and exceptional circumstances, but you'll recall Mr. Brown, Queen's Counsel, we agreed with, and other parties made submissions on the methodology of the Green Belt approach in this plan to the removal of sites. And you'll recall, sir, the issue about the different approach taken at stage 2 when sites, including my own client sites, was removed at stage 2 without any account of mitigation and other measures, which were then brought into play on the remaining sites at stage 3. And I won't repeat the debate there. But sir, it's highly pertinent to what Mr. Shadarivan is now seeking to rely on, which I don't believe was referred to, unfortunately, at matter 4 when this issue was discussed. Paras 136 and 137 of the Compton case. And of course, that's precisely the point. As you rightly say, and as Mr. Justice Ousley or Sir Duncan Ousley, as he was then, pointed out, mitigation measures are not generally, in principle, a reason for exceptional circumstances for release from the Green Belt. That's 136. And he said, other than as a meaning of choosing between competing sites where the potential for mitigation affected the choice. And that's precisely reinforces what we and Mr. Brown and others said when we were before matter 4, whilst the methodology was flawed. And it's interesting to see now that the council is seeking to rely on it. We say that just compounds the flaw in the methodology. As I say, I won't go back over matter 4, but given that the authority wasn't raised at that stage, I don't believe, I thought it's important just to hear our submissions on it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, every time someone puts their hand down, everyone moves across on the screen. Mr. Strawn, is it?
Yes, it is. Thank you very much, sir. Can I just come back to what I think the 2 questions that you asked were, just to make sure I'm addressing those. You asked about the assessment of exceptional circumstances versus the harm for this specific site. And then you had a follow-up question about the differences between benefits and mitigation. So I'm just got 3 points to make about those particular questions, and then I'll hand over to Mr. Russell Vick in a moment. Just the 3 points. First of all, sir, you probably heard a bit about the law, but that's, I suppose, what I'm here to address you on. there's been a reference to both the Compton Parish Council case, which I know you'd be familiar with, and I just want to make sure the examination's aware of the subsequent decision of Mr. Justice Holgate in the Keep-Bourne End Buckinghamshire Council case of 2020, because he's the head of the planning court and he looked at both the Compton decision and also the Calverley, if I got the correct name, Parish Council decision of Mr. Justice Jay, and both of those are referred to in various representations. And the reasons why I just want to draw your attention to that is to address your question about exceptional circumstances and overall assessment. The short point about the Keep-Bourne End Green decision is that Mr. Justice Holgate identified that the previous approaches, for example, the one discussed by Mr. Justice Jay in the Calverley case, Calverton, I should say, Calverton Parish Council, were not prescribing how either the local planning authority or indeed yourself go about an assessment of exceptional circumstances for greenbelt purposes. And indeed, there is no prescription. That's the point emphasized. And what the judge, Mr. Justice Holgate, recently endorsed is that a more discursive or open textured approach to the assessment of exceptional circumstances is a perfectly legitimate approach. And what, of course, that means is that simply trying to compartmentalize or box things into either a rigid process or indeed each circumstance, suggesting each circumstance has to be exceptional, is completely wrong. It's not what the policy requires, as the judge pointed out, and it's not, indeed, it's not sensible. And that's a very important point, because I don't think that's really, at least no one seems to have covered that subsequent decision. And if you want the reference to it, it's 2020 EWHC 1984 admin. And taking that forward, so to the question you've asked about overall assessment, in our submission, it's very clear that the council has done an overall assessment. You've heard about it from a number of officers from the council, but you've got it in the various documents in the evidence base. But in specific answer to your question, I take as an example the development strategy topic paper, and I apologize if I haven't got the right reference. I've got it as CD 3.64, but I think someone might have referred to it as a different number, but I hope that is the right number. It's the one in February 2021. And indeed, I think the council made reference to it in its hearing statement. But if you take that as an example, in fact, paragraph 6.179 through to 6.182, you find the council actually directing itself with the more exacting approach that was discussed in the Calverton case, even though, as I pointed out a moment ago, you're entitled to be more open textured, but they adopted an even stricter approach than the policy requires against themselves. And in that, there's a discussion of what happened in the Calverton case against the policy test, and that is the preamble to identifying the Greenbelt assessments that they did, including the stage 2 and stage 3 assessments, where, of course, as you've seen, there's identification of harms to the Greenbelt from development of this site, amongst others. And then, having done that, they then proceed to identify in the topic paper the exceptional circumstances that apply to justify the release of this site. They do it for the others as well. So you've got, I think I've given the right references, is at 6.183 onwards. I hope you've got that topic paper available. I hope I also gave the right reference to it. But you'll see that there is identified in that both the what I call the strategic exceptional circumstances for the whole spatial strategy, which we're not talking about specifically today, and then taking those on board, there's an application or consideration of the exceptional circumstance which justify the use of Tudeley Village. Amongst those things are the ones that you've already heard reference to, for example, flooding, the ability to cure flooding, exemplar design that's actually specific to this particular proposal. I mentioned the word exemplar design, and a host of other benefits that come and opportunities that come from this particular location. So we say that from that sort of documentation, and I say it's an example because you've heard of the decision-making process, the council plainly did consider the case for exceptional circumstance for release of this site in the full knowledge of their previous assessments of harm and the competing merits, but also taking account of the question, the approach to spatial strategy. And the cases make clear, of course, that exceptional circumstances can either be a single exceptional circumstance or a combination of circumstances which aren't themselves exceptional, but create an overall exceptional circumstances case. There's no requirement to try and categorize each of the circumstances in some particular way. And indeed, the cases also make clear that pure housing need can be an exceptional circumstance, contrary to what I think is said in a number of the hearing statements, although the council didn't, in fact, release simply on that basis, but that's clearly an important element. And so that brings me on then to the second question you asked, but the third point I want to make, this point about benefits versus mitigation and the question of harm. When you asked the question, you said, well, having reached views about harm, for example, to the greenbelt, you talked about very high level of harm in the stage 2 and then a high harm in stage 3, whether they then balance those things, and then you came on to the question of benefits versus mitigation. So just a note of caution, of course, that in relation to the conclusions on harm, if you take high level of harm from using a site like Tudeley, the principal reason for that conclusion is, of course, encroachment into the countryside, because if you go for a spatial strategy that involves using a new village in the greenbelt, releasing it, then of course you're going to take land out of the greenbelt, which was previously, in this case, countryside. The same, of course, would be true if you went for a pepper-potted approach of taking lots of smaller greenbelt sites out. Cumulatively, they also would have a high level of harm of encroaching into the countryside. As it happens, what you're doing is doing it strategically in one location for other reasons of sustainability, etc. So some caution to be attached to the notion that high level of harm is somehow peculiar as a solution to the alternatives, which would involve lots of other greenbelt removals. But that aside, though, they clearly did recognise, of course, high level of harm for that reason in the stage 3 assessment. They then went on to consider the exceptional circumstances. And what they've identified in terms of benefits, for example, versus mitigation, is similarly to be, in our submission, entirely correct. Just taking a couple of examples, perhaps the one you used, you can have things which are there to mitigate the impacts of development, but also deliver planning benefits. And that's fundamental.
Yeah, I think that was the same point that Mr. Shadarivian was making.
Well, so I apologize if it's repetitive, but certainly that's well established. And so I was just, if he's making that point about the bypass or flood mitigation, it's also made clear in that Compton case that he referred to. And so all we're pointing out is that not only has the council done the exercise legitimately and list those things it's identifying as beneficial are all capable, and indeed we would say strongly do create exceptional circumstances for this site, but they're acting entirely in accordance with an assessment which has been undertaken. I recognise not other people don't agree with it, of course, but that's the nature of these sorts of processes. But they've certainly done the exercise and justified the reason. So I'm just going to hand over to Mr. Russell-Vick.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on an area that perhaps Mrs. Young didn't cover in quite as much detail in terms of exceptional circumstances. She looked in some detail at the flooding, design, secondary school, and also the highway. There's a point just to do with accessibility, and also just I wanted to touch back again on the compensatory measures that the estate is proposing. That's obviously picked up in the policy itself at point 8, or draft policy at point 8. I think so. It should really be recognised that this particular site and particular ownership is almost unique in that it not only can deliver a scale of development, but also has land, substantial areas of land around it to deliver a whole range of other potential benefits and compensatory improvements to the greenbelt. And the compensatory improvements is picked up at 142 of the NPPF, and it talks about impact of removing land from the greenbelt can be offset through compensatory improvements to the environmental quality and accessibility of remaining greenbelt land. We see that again in slightly different guise, 145, but I think it's helpful. It says that once greenbelts have been defined, local planning authorities should plan positively to enhance their beneficial use, such as looking for opportunities to provide access, opportunities for outdoor sport and recreation, and to retain and enhance landscapes, visual amenity, and biodiversity. So, and the state's compensatory measures document has a number of plans and a number of proposals. Just for your note, won't take you to it specifically.
I can say, yeah, we don't need to go through those. I can take that as read.
We've got those points, but I think that,
those points.
Thank you. I'm not going to take you through them in detail, so quite right. But just to highlight the significant range of potential opportunities that this particular ownership provides.
Okay. Let's move on if possible. Go to Mr. Ritchie, because I want to just get through these comments, and then mindful will be going for over 2 hours. I do want to take a break, and I think we're starting to sort of go over some points. I don't want to say any repetitious points, if possible, please.
Okay, just a couple of few points to make. I know paragraph 142 of the framework has been mentioned, but whilst that's been referred to in the compensatory improvement set piece, we've not talked about the importance of achieving sustainable development, which were key facets in the Calverton judgment in paragraphs 10 and 51. I know Mr. Shedderarian did mention about the ability to achieve the internalisation of trips at Tudeley, but that is very much dependent upon delivery of the infrastructure and the facilities at an appropriate time. And that then also raises issues about the viability of that, and when the programme of those are to be delivered. I know we'll pick up on that later.
But
on the viability, just coming back on the flood alleviation measures and the justification of that as part of the exceptional circumstances, I'm looking at paragraph 66 to 68 of the council statement, which highlights it's the £2.5 million, but that funding is not included in any of the viability work as yet, as to whether or not the scheme is viable, and how whether or not the delivery of the flood alleviation measures may have to come forward in advance of other factors which are important to achieve the internalisation of trips and other facilities. So just balancing that as to
I think put a mark down that is something to definitely go into.
Okay.
Okay, go to the Ms. Farrah Brooks Johnson.
Thank you. Tudeley Village won't fund the Colts Hill bypass. Greg Clark MP could underline that, as could KCC Highways. I think it may have just been a misunderstanding. The Fog bypass, yes. Colts Hill bypass, no. So what this boils down to, as far as I can see, is you want to build, or the council wants to build, a town the size of Kings Hill right next to Tunbridge in order to provide flood betterment for a small village of 600 houses that already has an Environment Agency plan for flood betterment, that of course would welcome more funding, but funding is available from other sources, as Hugh Paston from the Parish Council and the Borough Council said. Fog didn't flood this winter, thankfully. It has had flooding problems, but the plans are well developed with the Environment Agency, including natural flood mitigation. Creating the new town doesn't help Tunbridge. It doesn't justify taking this enormous amount of land, good agricultural, food-producing land, recreational land for local people, for wildlife, for human beings. I don't believe it justifies those exceptional circumstances. And I don't think that exemplar design, flood betterment, or any of the other reasons given are suitable to satisfy the planning framework. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to the Horse Society next, and then to Mr. Roberts.
As we seem to be going into the compensatory improvements, I wanted to go through the
well, I said not. I said I didn't want to get into that.
Well, everybody else seems to have got into it.
Well, I did cut the gentleman off. So I said I don't want to start going into some details of the compensatory improvements at this stage, keeping it really at these sort of high level consideration of exceptional circumstances at this stage.
Well, all I would say at this stage is that there's going to be no improvement whatsoever in recreational facilities for horse riders. We're going to have livery stables removed with no certainty whatsoever of where or how it would be replaced, or whether it would be replaced within the borough. And there is absolutely nothing in the way of improved access to the green belt for horse riders. This borough is not short of public footpaths. We have the most extraordinarily large number of public footpaths, but we have a very, very small number of bridleways. And this is providing extra pedestrian access, which is something that isn't really particularly needed, and not providing the equestrian access that is desperately needed.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Roberts, finally.
Thank you. It's Paul Roberts, Tudeley Consulting, on behalf of the Hadlow Estate. I'm a chartered town planner and a chartered surveyor. I fear that I should be extremely brief in the circumstances. I'll make very two short points. The first point goes to the issue of reasonable alternatives, which are supposed to establish before you conclude there are exceptional circumstances. And having attended the event the last time you sat on the Friday, I can't identify where there are reasonable alternatives that are not in the AOMB or are not in the Greenbelt or are more sustainable than this scheme. So that's something that I think is notable as part of this process. And the second point, just to make very brief, sir, which we'll come back to later on, but I want you to note that we'll come back to it in this context, is obviously when you get past the reasonable alternatives, you then look at the sustainability of the settlement and the proximate nature of it. And when we deal with highways, the fourth matter on your highways list, I would hope that we'll be able to come back to the sustainability issue, and we can note that in relation to that judgment as part of exceptional circumstances, given that that we're short for time now.
Okay, there's a lot of detailed points that have been made there. Mr. Jones, any final points we've not heard?
I've listened very carefully to the now 3 representatives from Hadlow Estates. And I'm just conscious of time and also the procedural new note you issued to, I think in January, that only those who were seeking changes in the apposite part of the plan, I know that you've invited it, and I've struggled to see any changes that Hadlow Estates, and they're here presumably, commercial interest to defend their allocation, but I'm not seeing how that fits with your procedural note, and I'm conscious of the time. So I'd be guided by you, sir, how that sits with the ruling that you made in January. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, no, Hadlow Estates have duly made representations and attending on that behalf. But yeah, point noted that we don't need to hear from several participants of the same group, if that makes sense. It's not an effective use of time. What I will say is we will have a break. So it's time's race on to 12:25. What does just say we'll take a comfort break, and then I do want to sort of quickly touch upon point 3. I think what we'll probably do is we'll spend the next sort of 30 minutes or so upon point 3 of the agenda, and then I think what we'll want to do then is take a lunch break and then come back with a sort of fresh session and really look at section 4 on highways, which I know is sort of the a lot of the sort of the meat of this issue. And I think the last gentleman that spoke is right. Actually, the exceptional circumstances, lots of things feed into this. Highways, accessibility, sustainability, clearly one of those. So what I'll suggest is we'll take a 10-minute break, if that's okay, just until 25:02. So don't log out, just turn your cameras off and your microphones off. We'll have a 10-minute break and we'll resume at 25:02, please. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully everybody can still hear and see me okay. Excellent, fantastic. Okay, I want to move on to the sort of third item of the agenda. It's probably a shorter item, which will take us up towards the lunch break. And it's about whether or not it's clear to decision makers, developers and the local community what mix of uses will be expected. And this really stems, again, from a session that we had in the early stages of the examination, where, and we'll come on this afternoon in the context of highways to talk about this sort of internalization of trips and how people sort of will use this development, travel around. And one of the things that we discussed then was around the mix of uses and the expected level of employment that would be provided. So really question for the council. In terms of employment and other uses, what does the plan, or what does your submitted plan seek to deliver? And do you think that's sufficiently clear enough to be effective?
Thank you. I'll start on this one. Just taking a question, I understand sort of stemming from the employment, but I think there's wider implications. Just would refer you to the vision for Tudeley Village, which is set out in paragraph 5.218, which underpins what we're seeking to achieve at Tudeley Village, and that's a sustainable, self-contained new settlement underpinned by garden settlement principles. Now, what the policy seeks to do is set out the uses, and where appropriate to do so, the scale of the uses, to set the key parameters for the delivery of a new settlement at Tudeley Village. What it doesn't seek to do is provide a fixed blueprint or a fixed master plan, and reference to the Tudeley Village master plan at map 32 isn't a fixed master plan. It's just to identify the broad locations, but the policy makes clear that it will be through subsequent master planning that the policy hooks that sets out, as I say, the parameters are achieved. Now, where I say in terms of where we seek to stipulate the items of infrastructure, where we know the scale, we obviously have, through the master planning work done by the Hadlow estate, we have comfort that 2,800 dwellings can be achieved on this site, with all the other range of uses that are needed to deliver a new garden settlement in this location. Alongside that, we have a main village centre and expect around 3 neighbourhood centres, comprising, and we have a range of uses here that you'd expect from centres to serve your top-up shopping needs and your day-to-day shopping needs, such as commercial, employment and leisure. Now, we don't stipulate the amount of floor space in the policy, but the supporting text at paragraph 5.222 anticipates that it'd be around 10,000 square metres of commercial and office floor space within these village centre and neighbourhood centres. That has evolved, that figure has evolved through discussions with the Hadlow estate and what is set out in their delivery strategy. But we are comfortable that is appropriate when we look at the size of settlements comparable to the size of that Tudeley Village will be in our borough, in terms of the number, the population that will be generated from 2,800 homes. And for an example, Cranbrook is probably the most comparable size settlement within the borough, which has a population size of just under 7,000, 6,717, and we're calculating that Tudeley Village would have a population of around 7,000. That's based on census data 2011, but the data we had at the time of the Royal Assessment Study. Looking at the GOAD floor space for Cranbrook, and not just retail, but looking at a range of commercial floor space that GOAD does provide. In August 2020, it had around 11,000 square metres Cranbrook of floor space. That is a settlement B in our role and function study, core document 3.133. That sits below Royal Tunbridge Wells. So we are comfortable that that figure is broadly correct, and we have put that in the supporting text, but it will be through the development of a more detailed master plan and subsequent SPD and planning applications where that figure will be tested, and it will come forward and be determined through subsequent stages of the planning process more widely. We stipulate the size of the schools, secondary school and primary school, and that has stemmed through discussions with KCC Education, and that's been continually evolving throughout the production of the local plan, as set out in the infrastructure framework and in our statement of common ground with KCC. And then the other areas, such as open space, leisure and recreation areas. But again, it is not considered necessary to stipulate the precise requirements of those, because there are other policies in the plan and other considerations that will stem through the consideration of a more detailed master plan. What we haven't got in the policy are other aspirations that we know the Hadlow Estate will be keen to deliver, and I expect someone from the Hadlow Estate will jump in at some point during this discussion. Are areas such as a nursery or a health centre, and we did touch upon this at one of the previous matters. That is the list of items of infrastructure that we have set out and mix of uses have stemmed from what has been identified through discussions with the key infrastructure providers through the preparation of the infrastructure framework, which is called document 3.66A. And we put in the policy what was necessary. Now, that's not to say other uses won't be acceptable or encouraged to create a mix of uses, but we didn't want to provide a policy that was not flexible and wasn't effective in that regard. But I think it's clear that what we have done is set out a range of uses that provide for a sustainable new settlement, that will provide for a high level of internalisation of trips, whilst recognising that higher order centres such as Tunbridge and Paddock Wood will still be used for other services, but to create the sustainable new settlement in line with the aspirations of paragraph 73 of the NPPF and also the garden settlement principles.
So do you think it's appropriate then for the supporting text to refer to a floor space figure?
We think it is appropriate because it gives an indication of what we anticipate, but the policy sets out what is required, and that's a village centre with 3 neighbourhood centres. And I think it's then for the supporting text to expand on how that might look and what we'd expect. But we have said within that the level of floor space sought should be considered in a planning application and detailed master plan stage in retail terms or commercial terms, in terms of ensuring that's a level that will internalise trips and not divert expenditure away from some of the larger centres and affect their vitality and viability. So we've put a hook there with the retail test. So we think it is appropriate to put it in the supporting text to provide Hadlow Estate to come forward with a master plan that demonstrates that and to provide the flexibility. But I think with probably a lot of discussions that we're having on this subject, if it was considered by yourself that it would be better to stipulate that within the policy, then we would be open to consider that accordingly.
I'll just bring Mr. DeWitt, who just put his hand up here from the Tunbridge and Moreland Borough Council, may have something to say.
Thank you, sir. Yes, Nigel DeWitt, Principal Planning Officer representing Tunbridge and Moreland Borough Council, neighbouring authority. And in answer to the point on the agenda, it is unclear, especially to local communities, on what will be expected on site and when. The policy in the plan is lacking details, which are being relegated to the Framework Master Plan SPD, which does not form part of the development plan and will therefore enjoy less weight at decision taking. Well, we do expect the plan, in particular the policy or even a policy annex, to include a delivery trajectory for the strategic site, identifying high-level key phasing milestones, such as when the highway improvements need to be in place and operational, and when the schools need to be opened, and how these relate to the number of homes being built and how far into the build in terms of number of years. From what I've looked at and the evidence, this detail is lacking, and often it's too broadly referred to in other supporting documents with generic phrases such as medium, long term, which cover quite a wide number of years. So essentially, this lack of detail, this lack of clarity has created uncertainty. And this uncertainty has led to a lot of significant concerns from communities nearby in Tunbridge and Malling, East Peckham, Golden Green, Hadlow, and residents in Tunbridge, because it's very difficult and challenging to understand when they'll come on stream, how long the impacts will be felt, and it really is the development plan is the prime consideration to really set out these key milestones. Thank you.
Mr. Jones.
Thank you very much, sir. We agree with Mr. David, and in terms of the role of the development plan, insofar as, and we agree also with what Mr. David has just said, in terms of you cannot then look and put development control in SPD, and so you'll be aware of extensive case law now that really restricts the role of SPD. And particularly that links to the submissions we've made to you, sir, on this subject at 2 point, particularly on mix of uses, 2.9, so you don't need to turn it up, 2.22. And obviously our interest is elderly care, and within section, within the allocation SS 3.4, there's no clarity to the scale or location of any extra care facility. And we refer to Appendix 1 of our representations, and we discuss this, and I know at issue 3, but you will see, sir, there at para 2.4, the 4.2, sorry, the evidence from Inspire Village, who give evidence that they're regularly outbid for sites for elderly care to the wider commercial market housing. So in terms of mix, we don't see how the local authority can rely on this allocation. We don't have, in principle, issues about the allocation, but we do have in terms of any reliance placed on it for extra care, because there's no ring fencing, but even less than that, there's no indication of scale or location. And the evidence we've produced shows that the likelihood that even of such sites being outbid. There's also, we note as well, mention's been made as well of the master plan. There's no commitment in the master plan either for elderly care. That's all fine, and that may be no plans of the developers. We don't have an issue with it, but as we say, sir, we do have an issue if, as is the case, the council is seeking to rely upon this allocation as part of its fulfilment of elderly care provision. Thank you, sir.
Just on that point, just very quickly looking at the policy, I think it's point 12, secure developer contributions towards strategic growth. As set out in the strategic sites mass planning infrastructure study, and there's probably potentially some other references within it. So how do the council just respond to that point about sort of relegating some of this detail to future SPDs or essentially non-development plan documents, and how that would then be sort of appropriately considered? Obviously, they wouldn't be subject to, examination, for example. So how do the council think that they've got that balance right? Obviously, mindful that this is a local plan, it's strategic policies, setting out obviously land uses, etc. I don't think anyone's arguing that very specific, to the X square metre of individual uses would necessarily be required. But just how did the council respond on the point about, certainly Mr. DeWitt made there, about this sort of concern that things just getting relegated to sort of future SPDs, and how that would actually be controlled and managed?
Thank you. I think I'd start off by just highlighting that the policy is extensive and sets out a lot of detail of what's required at Tudeley Village, making specific reference to the extra care provision and Mr. Jones's commentary. If you look at clause or criteria 4, it specifically says at least one sheltered and one extra care housing scheme shall be provided within the strategic site. So when it comes to assessing of a master plan that's submitted for this allocation, the council will ensure through this policy that that is provided. Now, it's not been, a scale has not been determined, but our understanding that this is led by the market and typically, and I'm sure this will get brought up in the mix of housing session, but around sort of 100 units, it wasn't considered necessary, given it's market driven in that respect, to determine the scale, but we have set out an expectation there of what will be provided. Now, through this policy, we have set out clear, essentially what is needed to create a sustainable settlement in this location. We've set out the mix of uses, we've set out the permeable links, we've set out the high quality design. When it comes to housing, we've set out what's expected in terms of the mix of housing types and the affordable housing provision. And greenbelt, compensatory improvements, etc. There's a lot of detail here, and what essentially this is stemmed from is a consideration through the master planning work that the Hadlow estate have done, which is in fact very detailed for perhaps the local plan stage, and has progressed it to a very detailed level. But it's given us the confidence that in this location we can create a sustainable community of 2,800 homes that adhere to the garden settlement principles, that can be delivered, and we'll come on to that this afternoon. But what we haven't sought to do is prescribed, and I used the words earlier, a fixed blueprint, because it is for the subsequent stages to determine how our policy requirements will look on the ground. And we don't want an ineffective plan by providing too much sort of, well, a lack of flexibility around how that could form. We understand, we know it can form, and maybe there won't be too much deviation from what is shown on map 32, which shows the broad areas. And we have been working with the Hadlow estate and commenting on that accordingly. But we didn't want to prescribe a level of detail which goes over and above what perhaps would be expected at this stage, and would prevent future iterations which fully accord with the overarching framework set out through this policy to come forward. Now, going back specifically to Mr. DeWitt's comments and about the people reading the plan aren't aware of what's required, I would, and as you mentioned, Sir, under criterion 12, there's specific reference to the strategic sites master planning and infrastructure study, and that is called document 3.66A. Now, within that, table 11 on page 132 sets out every item of infrastructure that is required for Paddock Wood allocation, for the Tudeley Village allocation, and for both as shared. And with the shared items in infrastructure, that includes the Colts Hill bypass, which I know was mentioned previously, for being contributed by both Paddock Wood and Tudeley Village. That sets out under the category, the sort of how it's going to be delivered, if it's an on-site to be delivered by an individual promoter, or if it's to be delivered by all promoters. And then alongside that is broad phasing categories. And if you look at table 10 on page 130, that sets out the phasing assumed. That's short, medium, and longer term. So each item of infrastructure has got that. Each item of infrastructure is listed, and it's a very comprehensive schedule. And then a broad phasing has been dictated. Now, I'm conscious I don't want to go too much on what we might be discussing this afternoon, but those broad timeframes were considered appropriate at this level of plan making stage, because I think perhaps everyone around this table would agree that when delivering an allocation over 15 years, and in this case beyond, because this will be delivered beyond the plan period, so much will change in terms of the trigger points for delivery. We have, well, sorry, go back a step. This broad phasing stemmed from the housing trajectory from the Regulation 18 local plan, and that's what DLA used to inform this. and for the reasons of the fact that it is likely to change and there will be movement, we considered this provided a sound basis for the consideration of viability and to determine that it was deliverable, and that we understood when these key items of infrastructure would be provided. Now, as part of our ongoing work on as a strategic sites and delivery team, because we are planning beyond the local plan and seeking to progress applications, and I think as mentioned by Miss Ashton, who's acting on behalf of Redger and Persimmon on land east of Paddock Wood. I know we're discussing Tudeley Village, but it is relevant for the round. We are expecting a planning application on that site very shortly. So it is fundamental that we are progressing an understanding of how this is going to come forward and when. And we do have more detailed triggers that have evolved through discussions with KCC Highways, the Education Authority, the Clinical Commissioning Group on healthcare, those key infrastructure triggers. We do have a further understanding of that through our ongoing work to facilitate the delivery of these sites. And we haven't, we expect that to continually evolve, and think that this table 11, that as referred to within our policy, provides a framework to make it clear to what is required and when, but B, to provide for any further sort of phasing and implementation requirements moving forward.
We'll come on to look at deliverability and in particular sort of phasing under section 5. But how would the council, and this goes to the effectiveness of the policy, so how would the council at planning application stage ensure that this was, that it came forward as the council, we've heard a lot about the council's vision for this site, and I've read a lot about that. How would the council actually ensure that comes forward? And, we wouldn't get a situation of, I don't mean this in a sort of derogatory term, but effectively, a sort of phase one where a couple of house builders would build out a couple of phases, and there would be, a supermarket built, and and this is a point that sort of representations have made about, you've got this sort of very lengthy, wordy policy, talks a lot about all these mix of uses and exemplar design, and we've heard a lot about that from Hadlow Estate. But how will the council actually, when presumably the outline application sort of comes in to start with, how will it actually control that at the development control stage and make sure that there is an appropriate mix of uses, and it's the sort of things that the vision talks about?
So if I can point you to the third paragraph from the end of the policy on page 163 of the plan. Expect the fourth from bottom paragraph, we start there. It says the development will be delivered through the production of a framework master plan, SPD, to guide development in respect of the garden settlement principles and creation of new community. The SPD will set out broad principles to show how the above policy requirements, together with other policies within this plan, should be delivered on the site, and will set out the phasing for delivery of the key elements and associated infrastructure. The SPD will need to ensure all elements of the proposals are considered comprehensively following a master plan approach, and proposals for the piecemeal development of individual sites elements within the settlement without the comprehensive master plan approach will not be supported. So clearly it's setting out there what approach is required. In approving the SPDs, the council will be approving the key elements of the proposed development over the entirety of the site, and will be in a position through this to ensure that the policy requirements, as far as the components of development are concerned, are included. I will come on to deal with delivery and the mechanism for delivery and ensuring that this afternoon. I don't want to sort of stray into that. And there are mechanisms which can be incorporated into this policy, which have been used elsewhere through the modifications procedure, and talk about other authorities where similar issues have arisen in relation to strategic allocations that deal with the implementation of the policy and delivery, but I'll come on to that this afternoon. So clearly what this is doing is saying, this is what's expected. Now, the SPD is not going to set out policy requirements. Of course, it can't do that. This policy has to do that. So if there is any deficiency in the policy as drafted, and it needs to be made more effective by giving greater certainty to the components and their extent, and taking the retail element as one of those, one would want to ensure, of course, that the retail fraction of the development is of such a scale that it's intended primarily to maintain the sustainability of the settlement, not intended to draw custom from outside the settlement. Similarly, with employment uses, those employment uses quite clearly are intended to support the settlement, the population within the settlement, and not intended to, as it were, draw flows from outside the settlement. It's meant to maximize the internalization of the settlement. So it's quite possible in those circumstances to modify the policy again by giving approximate idea of the floor space elements in relation to each of those elements, should that be seen to be necessary. Having said that, because sites like this are evolving over a longish period of time, it's important also that the policy retains flexibility. And we know that's one of the key objectives of government guidance in relation to forward planning. And to maintain that flexibility in the future, so as to ensure that the allocation remains effective in its overriding objective to provide the level of housing intended. So we can certainly give, reflect upon and give consideration to firming up the floor spaces. And in terms of delivery and timing of provision of supporting infrastructure, that's a matter which I will discuss this afternoon by reference to the importation of a requirement for the applicant to provide a phasing and implementation plan to sit behind the SPDs. I hope that helps. So just dealing with the one matter which you've picked up on already, which is the employment. Having assessed the overall provision of around 10,000 square meters, seems to me that indication should be given within the policy if that assists in bringing greater certainty and a better management of quality to the policy. And it might be possible also to specify the use class to which, within which the particular employment is intended to.
I think obviously we'll hear what other people have got to say on this, and we'll go on this afternoon to talk about deliverability and implementation. I think there does need to be more about phasing. I think there does need to be more about implementation, and I think there does need to be more about I think provision of employment space. There's a careful balance with these, these strategic allocations, and there's a careful balance that needs to be struck between, not constraining development and allowing the master plans to come forward in greater detail. But I think this is probably just slightly on the side of, a bit too vague to be effective. Provision of employment floor space, it doesn't really sort of leave, decision makers, local communities, the council even, with much certainty as to what that actually means. And some of the things that the council's witness was talking about there about not getting significant retail uses or significant employment uses, they're going to draw trade and employment from other areas. That maybe needs to be clear in the policy. If that's what's intended, then it needs to be clearer in order to be effective. But yeah, mindful that we'll come on to talk about deliverability in a bit more detail. Okay, where have we got to? Mr. Strawn, I think.
Yes, it's Paul Roberts, so I'll be brief. I agree with Mrs. Young and her assessment regarding flexibility. But we have done in the Tudeley Village Deliverment Strategy, we have in the various plans detailed breakdowns of the quantum of housing, leisure, there are allotments, sports pitches, and we've given a quantum what we think is an appropriate ratio of retail versus employment space as part of the process. And it's sort of reflected really in map 32 in the document. If it was thought that it was helpful to go a little further and prescribe some aspects that were in line with the delivery strategy, we'd be comfortable with that.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you. So just a short point, which I've made before, but you'll note on the map, the plan of Tudeley Village in the local plan submission draft, there's a space allocated for a railway station, but there's a recognition that it won't be delivered within the plan period, and there seems to be some doubt as to exactly when it will be delivered. I know you're concentrating on employment floor space primarily here, but obviously deliverability or the provisional or not of a railway station is quite significant, particularly in terms of the sustainability of the site. So just wanted to make sure you had a note of that for your consideration.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing within the plan or policy that requires the provision of a train station. So that's not a requirement.
Nothing in the written text of the policy, but there is space allocated in the plan, the site plan that's included as part of the.
Yes, I think map 32. I think there's probably some confusion here. So map 32, and if it doesn't do this, it probably needs to do it. So map 32 it's not a sort of layout plan. It's not a land use allocation plan. It's a sort of indicative for information only. This is part of what could be envisaged. That's how I read it, and I can see some heads nodding. So again, I might need to go back and just double check the supporting text or what the plans say. But when we touched upon this for Paddock Wood, actually, and no doubt we'll come back to it tomorrow, it's difficult because these plans they're intended to sort of aid and assist, but then there's this sort of that problem occurs, doesn't it? About, okay, well, it says that on the plan, so surely that's going to be what's provided. So I think, the council needs to make it abundantly clear that is, sort of for illustrative purposes only. As far as the train station is concerned, we'll talk about it this afternoon in terms of accessibility, but there's no requirement for that. That's, as far as I'm aware, not part of the allocation.
That's correct. And just to confirm, it has never formed part of our consideration on the sustainability of this settlement through any of the evidence-based documents.
Okay, Mr. Russell.
There we go. Hello, sir. Yeah, I just make a few points on the land uses. Something that strikes me, the points about delivery and timing, I think those have been eloquently made by others. So we won't press on those, but something that just struck me is there's an alignment between Tudeley Village and East Cape or Paddock Wood. There are a lot between the two policies covering these developments. There are quite a lot of land uses proposed. So I think when we're looking at trigger points for delivery of these, it's important to look at the two sites in parallel. For example, there's a leisure centre coming in at Paddock Wood, which would be good for residents of Tudeley Village. But when you move into Tudeley Village, it's not going to be in Tudeley Village. Conversely, there's a secondary school coming in Tudeley Village. That's clearly going to draw students from elsewhere within Tunbridge Wells. And my assumption is that the intention is that would also serve development at Paddockwood and East Capel. So it's important when we're looking at trigger points for when this infrastructure is needed, that we look in the round at all the infrastructure between these sites. Moving on to higher order services, I was interested to hear from Mr. DeWitt. Something that very much strikes me is that spatially Tudeley is very much an urban extension almost to Tonbridge rather than Tunbridge Wells facing. It's about 3 miles to the centre of Tonbridge, and my view would be certainly the first occupiers, and I think it's useful to think of this at a person level. When you're first bought your new home at Tudeley Garden Village, what's going to be there? If it's not there, where are you going to look to find those services? You're automatically going to travel towards Tonbridge because that is the nearest higher order.
I think we're straying into after lunch there, Mr. Russell.
Are we? Right.
Yeah, it's opening a much larger discussion, because that's exactly the points around, you know, sustainable travel and deliverability.
In which case, I will respectfully hold on to those till after lunch, then, sir.
Yeah. Completely understand the points that are being made. It's about, you know, when things are provided, and you know where people would, you know, automatically go to get those services and facilities. Okay, thank you, Mr. Russell. Mr. Bell.
No, but in the concept of isn't there the point? It's about. Thank you, sir. Sorry, a bit of a problem there accessing the camera. And so we've listened at this end to all the points that everyone else has made in respect of how clear this is to the local community as to the development coming forward and the mix of use. And so on behalf of the parish council and Save Capel, it remains unclear to the local community as to what is to be expected, and in particular in respect of delivery and phasing. I mean, sir, having listened to the council today, much of what is said in terms of where is the clarity over this seems to be suggested that it will be included in SPDs. So I just raise with you that the issue with SPDs is, of course, that they aren't rigorously examined in the same way that this local plan is being examined, So there's a case, William Davis Limited and others, and Charnwood Borough Council, and the citations 2017 EWHC 3006. And so I would be urging you to take some care in respect of where the council is saying this information will be coming through in SPDs, because of course SPDs, as I said earlier, are largely untested, and so it can be a way to allow through unjustified and ineffective policy through the use of SPDs. So in respect to the mix of use, one of the things that has been of concern to Save Capel, and it is a point that Mr. Gledhill, I understand on behalf of Save Capel, made at the matter 2 employment needs sessions, is in effect that the development at Tudeley really doesn't contain any employment. It's not discussed really in any employment plan, and indeed, effectively, what's being proposed to Save Capel and to the parish council is something that's effectively going to become a commuter town, reliant on other settlements either near or further away. And so, just put quite simply, having a commuter town and having a local authority saying to you that kind of details about kind of the use will come forward by way of SPDs, it's not providing you with evidence of sustainability. Effectively, it is a development that is looking like it would be dependent on other nearby urban settlements.
Okay, yeah, again, a point for this afternoon. Ms. Farrowbrooks Johnson.
Thank you. I just have a point to make on mix of uses and the space allocated to each use. I understand this relies on master planning. In East Capel, just up the road, the master planning is controlled by Tunbridge Wells Borough Council, and they made great efforts to do that, and it refers back to Mrs. Young's reference to the planning application. That was an East Capel planning application. In Tudeley, it's controlled by the Hadlow estate. And I wonder why Tunbridge Wells Borough Council haven't taken a more proactive approach to the master planning in Tudeley Village, given that it's much larger than the East Capel site, and it is also a strategic site. So I'd be curious to understand why master planning is done so differently for Tudeley as it is for East Capel. Thank you.
And finally, Ms. Borland, please.
Thank you. I think you're probably going to say that this comes under the viability discussions, but my concerns are actually getting people into all these buildings that we're talking about. And I think there needs to be discussion about whether there's going to be any carrots to get the businesses that will be paying the sort of salaries that residents will need to buy a house in this new development, and whether there are going to be any sticks to ensure that the resident, or to help the residents decide to use the local facilities. I'm particularly thinking the comment that was made about being a commuter town. If I'm commuting via Tunbridge Station, even if I'm only doing that 2-3 days a week, I would have thought I'm much more likely to stop at one of the supermarkets in Tunbridge on my way home rather than the local shop in Tudeley, which will have less variety and choice. But I think from what's been said earlier, that is probably a discussion under viability.
Yeah, I think there's probably a discussion, and there's a specific question, wasn't there, on the agenda about whether or not this is a location that can be made sustainable through limiting needs travel and offering a genuine choice of transport modes. So yeah, some of the crossover themes are probably around there that it's best to be discussed. I think naturally we're leading into the highways topic, which I know is sort of the main topic for conversation. So I propose we would sort of leave it there. So we'll come back to this issue of obviously council suggested there could be some modifications made. I think there does need to be, obviously I know that we've not got through the rest of the discussion on this topic and others, but I think from just a sort of laying the marker down at the minute, I think there probably does need to be just a look at the wording, and it goes to the heart of effectiveness of that policy, and it's around effectiveness. And also, I do share some of the views around just that balance between, yes, strategic policy needs to be flexible, but not sort of relegating everything to future SPDs and master plans, etc., which obviously would fall outside of the development plan. So it's a tricky one. It's a fine balance. I think at the moment, in some respects, it's probably just a little bit too much on the flexibility, and there's probably a bit of ambiguity there that sort of goes to effectiveness. So
I'm confident that those matters can be addressed because it's all in the evidence base, and it's a question of importing sufficient greater certainty, the kind of certainty you're looking for and others are looking for, in terms of the components and types of uses, and that can be done. I'm thinking also about capping the floor space of individual retail stores, for example, so we don't end up with the situation as happened somewhere in Cambridgeshire, where a very large supermarket suddenly appears and completely undermines the justification for the retail component, and the sustainability of the settlement. So I'm very mindful of that. I'm very confident that drafting changes can be effected to make the policy more effective. And I will put my mind to that with the council and also speak to others in that process.
Okay, we'll come back then after lunch. We'll take an adjournment from lunch. we've got about 40 minutes. I think that should just be about fine. I'm mindful that the next session was due to schedule to start at 2 o'clock. So is that okay with the council? Do you want us to take a slightly short lunch and come back at 2?
So we're entirely in your hands, whatever you think is best.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's absolutely fine. We'll take 40 minutes for lunch then, if that's okay. And so if people, just a reminder, so people need to leave this session and then they need to rejoin. Again, if you just rejoin 5 or 10 minutes before, just a quick check that your microphones and cameras are still working. So leave this session and then rejoin the session for this afternoon. That the link was sent from the programme officer. Thank you very much. Okay, see you at 2 o'clock.